Ooh. Okay, I'll just get comfy. Okay, hello everyone. Thank you for joining me on this live stream at 9:00 GMT. I'm joining you from Sheffield, the first city of the north, seat of the former People's Republic of South Yorkshire. And today we're going to be doing a live stream charity reading for Shelter, the UK homelessness charity. I've chosen this charity and to do this live streaming because the pandemic has put a huge strain on the lives of private tenants and on landlords as well, landlords and letting agents, which means that many landlords and letting agents have tried to get around a lot of the restrictions placed upon them and have been mistreating many tenants and, well, just threatening them with evictions and all sorts of punitive measures, trying to overcharge them for services that are never delivered. And so with the government's ban on evictions coming to an end next month, I just wanted to try and raise some funds for Shelter, a charity which does a lot to help people who are facing homelessness and eviction. And I thought, well, I may as well do a live stream reading because I've been told I actually have quite a nice reading voice. And, well, yeah, I enjoy reading. And it gives me a chance to read a classic work of sociological study into the poorest people in society, which is going to be Engels's The Condition of the Working Class in England. Now, just to give some information on this, Friedrich Engels wrote this book when he was a young man between 1842 and 1844, and he was working for his father's linen factory, I think it was, in Manchester, England. And he wrote this book based on the observations he saw of the workers in the factory and in the surrounding suburbs of Manchester, but also other places like Liverpool and Carlisle. During what was the height of the Industrial Revolution, Manchester was considered the seat of the Industrial Revolution, and the poverty and exploitation he saw all around him. It was first published in 1845 in German as Die Lage der arbeitenden Klasse in England, and received its first English translation in 1885. And when Karl Marx met Engels, they discussed many of their theories. However, it wasn't until their second meeting that Marx actually read The Condition of the Working Class in England. But he was suitably impressed by this, so that him and Engels sprang up a famously fruitful working relationship, which of course culminated in texts like the Communist Manifesto. And this whole period is covered very well in the film The Young Karl Marx, which I would recommend watching if you're able to get hold of it with English subtitles. It's a bit hard to get hold of here in the UK. So I'd just like to quickly give a brief shout out to my community union, Acorn, which have been doing some great work helping support people who are facing eviction and homelessness during the pandemic. They've also been doing things like food deliveries and food parcels to help out. And so I just want to give them a quick shout out. And I'd encourage everyone to look them up, acorntheunion.org.uk. And just to explain how this is going to work. Now, the version I'm reading The Condition of the Working Class in England from is the Penguin Classics Kindle version. Sorry to give some free advertising to Jeff Bezos, but it just makes it easier because the Kindle allows you to see what the expected reading time is. Now, the expected reading time for this is going to be 8 hours and 30 minutes. However, that's including the foreword by Victor Kiernan and presumably any notes and indexes, which I'm not going to read out because, well, I just think it would be less interesting for you as a reader and personally for me as well. So I am going to be streaming as long as I can. However, I know YouTube sets a limit on how long you can live stream for. So I may have to quickly upload another video, which I may ask you to join. And also, I'm not going to be reading for 8 hours straight. I will need to take occasional toilet breaks, and I am going to just pop off to get a quick snack every now and again. So just to let you know, you may be staring at my spare bedroom for a little time whilst I'm off camera. But, I hope this is enjoyable. I hope it's worthwhile. You feel it's worthwhile tuning in. And as I said, the link to the fundraiser is in the description of the video. So please, if you're able to donate anything at all, then please go ahead to the justgiving.com link and please consider making a donation. Okay, so having said all that, let's make a start. So, Friedrich Engels, The Condition of the Working Class in England. So, I'm going to go to the working classes of Great Britain. Working men, to you I dedicate a work in which I have tried to lay before my German countrymen a faithful picture of your condition, of your sufferings and struggles, of your hopes and prospects. I have lived long enough amidst you to know something about your circumstances. I have devoted to their knowledge my most serious attention. I have studied the various official and non-official documents as far as I was able to get hold of them. I have not been satisfied with this. I wanted more than a mere abstract knowledge of my subject. I wanted to see you in your own homes, to observe you in your everyday life, to chat with you on your condition and grievances, to witness your struggles against the social and political power of your oppressors. I have done so. I forsook the company and dinner parties, the port wine and champagne of the middle classes, and devoted my leisure hours almost exclusively to the intercourse with plain working men. I am both glad and proud of having done so. Glad because thus I was induced to spend many a happy hour in obtaining a knowledge of the realities of life, many an hour which else would have been wasted in fashionable talk and tiresome etiquette. Proud because thus I got an opportunity of doing justice to an oppressed and calumniated class of men who, with all their faults and under all the disadvantages of their situation, yet command the respect of every one but an English moneymonger. Proud, too, because thus I was placed in a position to save the English people from the growing contempt on which the continent has been the necessary consequence of the brutally selfish policy and general behavior of your ruling middle class. Having, at the same time, ample opportunity to watch the middle classes, your opponents, I soon came to the conclusion that you are right, perfectly right in expecting no support whatsoever from them. Their interest is diametrically opposed to yours, though they always will try to maintain the contrary, and to make you believe in their most hearty sympathy with your fates. Their doings give them the lie. I hope to have collected more than sufficient evidence of the fact that, be their words what they please, the middle classes intend in reality nothing else but to enrich themselves by your labor while they can sell its produce, and to abandon you to starvation as soon as they cannot make a profit by this indirect trade in human flesh. What have they done to prove their professed goodwill towards you? Have they ever paid any serious attention to your grievances? Have they done more than paying the expenses of half a dozen commissions of inquiry, whose voluminous reports are damned to everlasting slumber among heaps of waste paper on the shelves of the Home Office? Have they even done as much as to compile from those rotting blue books a single readable book from which everybody might easily get some information on the condition of the great majority of free-born Britons? Not they indeed. Those are things they do not like to speak of. They have left it to a foreigner to inform the civilized world of the degrading situation you have to live in. A foreigner to them, not to you, I hope. Though my English may not be pure, yet I hope you will find it plain English. No working man in England, nor in France either, by the by, ever treated me as a foreigner. With the greatest pleasure I observed you to be free from that blasting curse, national prejudice and national pride, which after all means nothing but wholesale selfishness. I observed you to sympathize with everyone who earnestly applies his powers to human progress, may he be an Englishman or not, to admire everything great and good, whether nursed in your native soil or not. I found you to be more than mere Englishmen, members of a single isolated nation. I found you to be men, members of the great and universal family of mankind, who know their interests and that of all the human race to be the same. And as such, as members of this family of one and indivisible mankind, as human beings in the most emphatic meaning of the word, as such I, and many others on the continent, hail your progress in every direction and wish you speedy success. Go on then as you have done hitherto. Much remains to be undergone. Be firm, be undaunted. Your success is certain. and no step you will have to take in your onward march will be lost to our common cause, the cause of humanity. Friedrich Engels, Barmen, Rhinen, Prussia, 15th of March, 1845. Preface to the first German edition. The book prefaced by the following pages treats of a subject which I originally intended to deal with in a single chapter of a more comprehensive work on the social history of England. However, the importance of that subject soon made it necessary for me to investigate it separately. The condition of the working class is the real basis and point of departure of all social movements of the present, because it is the highest and most unconcealed pinnacle of the social misery existing in our day. French and German working-class communism are its direct, Fourierism and English socialism, as well as the communism of the German-educated bourgeoisie, are its indirect products. A knowledge of proletarian conditions is absolutely necessary to provide solid ground for socialist theories, on the one hand, and for judgments about their right to exist, on the other, and to put an end to all sentimental dreams and fancies pro and con. But proletarian conditions exist in their classical form, in their perfection, only in the British Isles, particularly in England proper. Besides, only in England has the necessary material been as completely collected and put on record by official inquiries as is essential for any in the least exhaustive presentation of the subject. For 21 months, I had the opportunity to become acquainted with the English proletariat, its strivings, its sorrows, and its joy, to see them from near, from personal observation and personal intercourse, and at the same time to supplement my observations by recourse to the requisite authentic sources. What I have seen, heard, and read has been worked up in the present book. I am prepared to see not only my standpoint attacked in many quarters, but also the facts I have cited, particularly when the book gets into the hands of the English. I know equally well that here and there I may be proved wrong in some particular of no importance, something that in view of the comprehensive nature of the subject and its far-reaching assumptions, even an Englishman might be unable to avoid. The more so since even in England there exists as yet not a single piece of writing which, like mine, includes all the workers. But without a moment's hesitation, I challenge the English bourgeoisie to prove that even in a single instance of any consequence, for the exposition of my point of view as a whole, I have been guilty of any inaccuracy, and to prove it by data as authentic as mine. A description of the classical form which the conditions of existence of the proletariat have assumed in Britain is very important, particularly for Germany, and precisely at the present moment. German socialism and communism have grown, more than any other, from theoretical premises. We German theoreticians still knew much too little of the real world to be driven directly by the real conditions to reforms of this bad reality. At any rate, almost none of the avowed champions of such reforms arrived at communism otherwise than by way of the Feuerbachian dissolution of Hegelian speculation. The real conditions of life of the proletariat are so little known among us that even the well-meaning societies for the uplift of the working classes, in which our bourgeoisie is now bungling the social question, constantly start out from the most ridiculous and preposterous judgments concerning the condition of the workers. We Germans, more than anybody else, stand in need of a knowledge of the facts concerning this question. And while the conditions of existence of Germany's proletariat have not assumed the classical form that they have in England, we nevertheless have, at bottom, the same social order, which sooner or later must necessarily reach the same extremes as it has already attained across the North Sea, unless the intelligence of the nation brings about the adoption of measures that will provide a new basis for the whole social system. The root causes whose effect in England has been the misery and oppression of the proletariat exist also in Germany, and in the long run must engender the same results. In the meantime, however, the established fact of wretched conditions in England will impel us to establish also the fact of wretched conditions in Germany, and will provide us with a yardstick wherewith to measure their extent and their magnitude of the danger brought to light by the Silesian and Bohemian disturbances, which directly threatens the tranquility of Germany from that quarter. Finally, there are still two remarks I wish to make. Firstly, that I have used the word Mittelklasse all along in the sense of the English middle class, or middle classes as is said almost always. Like the French word bourgeoisie, it means the possessing class, specifically that possessing class which is differentiated from the so-called aristocracy, the class which in France and England is directly, and in Germany, under the guise of public opinion, indirectly in possession of political power. Similarly, I have continually used the expressions working men, Arbeiter, and proletarians, working class, propertyless class, and proletariat as equivalents. Secondly, that in the case of most of the quotations I have indicated the party districts, while the conservatives, conversely, acknowledge the misery in the factory districts but disclaim any knowledge of it in the agricultural areas. For the same reason, whenever I lacked official documents for describing the condition of the industrial workers, I always preferred to present proof from liberal sources in order to defeat the liberal bourgeoisie by casting their own words in their teeth. I cited Tories or Chartists in my support only when I could confirm their correctness from personal observation or was convinced of the truthfulness of the facts quoted because of the personal or literary reputation of the authorities I referred to. Friedrich Engels, Barman, Wien and Prussia, 16th of March, 1845. Okay, preface to the English edition. The book, an English translation of which is here republished, was first issued in Germany in 1845. The author at that time was young, 24 years of age, and his production bears the stamp of his youth with its good and its faulty features, of neither of which he feels ashamed. It was translated into English in 1885 by an American lady, Mrs. F. Kelly Wisniewski, and published in the following year in New York. The American edition being as good as exhausted, and having never been extensively circulated on this side of the Atlantic, the present English copyright edition is brought out with the full consent of all parties interested. For the American edition, a new preface and an appendix were written in English by the author. The first had little to do with the book itself. It discussed the American working class movement of the day and is therefore here omitted as irrelevant. The second, the original preface, is largely made use of in the present introductory remarks. The state of things described in this book belongs today, in many respects, to the past, as far as England is concerned. Though not expressly stated in our recognized treatises, it is still a law of the modern political economy that the larger the scale on which capitalistic production is carried on, the less can it support the petty devices of swindling and pilfering which characterize its early stages. The pettifogging business tricks of the Polish Jew, the representative in Europe of commerce in its lowest stage, those tricks that serve him so well in his own country and are generally practiced there, he finds to be out of date and out of place when he comes to Hamburg or Berlin. And again, the commission agent who hails from Berlin or Hamburg, Jew or Christian, after frequenting the Manchester Exchange for a few months, finds out that in order to buy cotton yarn or cloth cheap, he too had better drop those slightly more refined but still miserable wiles and subterfuges which are considered the acme of cleverness in his native country. The fact is, those tricks do not pay any longer into a large market, where time is money, and where a certain standard of commercial morality is unavoidably developed, purely as a means of saving time and trouble. And it is the same with the relation between the manufacturer and his hands. The revival of trade after the crisis of 1847 was the dawn of a new industrial epoch. The repeal of the Corn Laws and the financial reforms subsequent thereon gave to English industry and commerce all the elbow room they had asked for. The discovery of the Californian and Australian goldfields followed in rapid succession. The colonial markets developed an increasing rate their capacity for absorbing English manufactured goods. In India, millions of hand weavers were finally crushed out by the Lancashire power loom. China was more and more being opened up. Above all, the United States, then commercially speaking, a mere colonial market, but by far the biggest of them all, underwent an economic development astounding even for that rapidly progressive country. And finally, the new means of communication introduced at the close of the preceding period, railways and ocean steamers, were now worked out on an international scale. They realized actually what had hitherto existed only potentially, a world market. This world market at first was composed of a number of chiefly or entirely agricultural countries grouped around one manufacturing centre, England, which consumed the greater part of their surplus raw produce and supplied them in return with the greater part of their requirements in manufactured articles. No wonder England's industrial progress was colossal and unparalleled, and such the status of 1844 now appears to us as comparatively primitive and insignificant. And in proportion as this increase took place, in the same proportion did manufacturing industry become apparently moralized. The competition of manufacturer always against manufacturer by means of petty thefts upon the work people did no longer pay. Trade had grown such low means of making money they were not worthwhile practicing for the manufacturing millionaire, and served merely to keep alive the competition of smaller traders, thankful to pick up a penny wherever they could. Thus, the truck system was suppressed, the 10 hours bill was enacted, and a number of other secondary reforms introduced, much against the spirit of free trade and unbridled competition, but quite as much in favour of the giant capitalist in his competition with his less favoured brother. Moreover, the larger the concern, and with it the number of hands, the greater the loss and inconvenience caused by every conflict between master and men. And thus a new spirit came over the masters, especially the large ones, which taught them to avoid unnecessary squabbles, to acquiesce in the existence and power of trade unions, and finally even to discover in strikes, at opportune times, a powerful means to serve their own ends. The largest manufacturers, formerly the leaders of the war against the working class, were now the foremost to preach peace and harmony. And for a very good reason. The fact is that all these concessions to justice and philanthropy were nothing else but means to accelerate the concentration of capital in the hands of the few, for whom the niggardly extortions of former years has lost all importance and have become actual nuisances, and to crush all the quicker and all the safer their smaller competitors who could not make both ends meet without such perquisites. Thus the development of production on the basis of the capitalistic system has of itself sufficed, at least in the leading industries, for in the more unimportant branches this is far from being the case, to do away with all those minor grievances which aggravated the workman's fate during its earlier stages. And thus it renders more and more evident the great central fact that the cause of the miserable condition of the working class is to be sought not in these minor grievances, but in the capitalistic system itself. The wage worker sells to the capitalist his labour force for a certain daily sum. After a few hours' work he has reproduced the value of that sum. But the substance of his contract is that he has to work another series of hours to complete his working day, and the value he produces during these additional hours of surplus labour is surplus value, which costs the capitalist nothing, but yet goes into his pocket. That is the basis of the system which tends more and more to split up civilized society into a few Rothschilds and Vanderbilts, the owners of the means of production and subsistence, on the one hand, and an immense number of wage workers, the owners of nothing but their labour force, on the other. And that this result is caused not by this or that secondary grievance, but by the system itself, this fact has been brought out in bold relief by the development of capitalism in England since 1847. Again, repeated visitations of cholera, typhus, smallpox, and other epidemics have shown the British bourgeois the urgent necessity of sanitation in his towns and cities, if he wishes to save himself and family from falling victim to such diseases. Accordingly, the most crying abuses described in this book have either disappeared or have been made less conspicuous. Drainage has been introduced or improved, wide avenues have been opened out athwart many of the most worst slums I have to describe. Little Ireland has disappeared, and the 7 Dials are next on the list for sweeping away. But what of that? Whole districts which in 1844 I could describe as almost idyllic have now, with the growth of the towns, fallen into the same state of dilapidation, discomfort, and misery. Only the pigs and the heaps of refuse are no longer tolerated. The bourgeoisie have made further progress in the art of hiding the distress of the working class. But that, in regard to their dwellings, no substantial improvement has taken place is amply proved by the report of the Royal Commission on the Housing of the Poor from 1885. And this is the case too in other respects. Police regulations have been plentiful as blackberries, but they can only hedge in the distress of the workers, they cannot remove it. But while England has thus outgrown the juvenile state of capitalist exploitation described by me, other countries have only just attained it. France, Germany, and especially America are the formidable competitors who, at this moment, as foreseen by me in 1844, are more and more breaking up England's industrial monopoly. Their manufacturers are young as compared with those in England, but increasing at a far more rapid rate than the latter. And curious enough, they have at this moment arrived at about the same phase of development as English manufacture in 1844. With regard to America, the parallel is indeed most striking. True, the external surroundings in which the working class is placed in America are very different, but the same economical laws are at work, and the results, if not identical in every respect, must still be of the same order. Hence, we find in America the same struggles for a shorter working day, for a legal limitation of the working time, especially of women and of children in factories. We find the truck system in full blossom, and the culture system in rural districts made use of by the bosses as a means of domination over the workers. When I received in 1886 the American papers with accounts of the great strike of 12,000 Pennsylvania coal miners in the Connellsville district, I seemed but to read my own description of the North of England colliers' strike of 1844. The same cheating of the workpeople by false measure, the same truck system, the same attempt to break the miners' resistance by the capitalist laws but crushing resource, the eviction of the men out of their dwellings, the cottages owned by the companies. I have not attempted in this translation to bring the book up to date or to point out in detail all the changes that have taken place since 1844, and for two reasons. Firstly, to do this properly, the size of the book must be almost doubled. And secondly, the first volume of Das Kapital by Karl Marx, an English translation of which is before the public, contains a very ample description of the state of the British working class, as it was about 1865, that is to say, at the time when British industrial prosperity reached its culminating point. I should then have been obliged again to go over the ground already covered by Marx's celebrated work. It will be hardly necessary to point out that the general theoretical standpoint of this book, philosophical, economical, political, does not exactly coincide with my standpoint of today. Modern international socialism, since fully developed as a science, chiefly and almost exclusively for the efforts of Marx, did not as yet exist in 1844. My book represents one of the phases of its embryonic development, and as the human embryo, in its early stages, still reproduces the gill arches of our fish ancestors, so this book exhibits everywhere the traces of the descent of modern socialism from one of its ancestors, German philosophy. Thus, great stress is laid on the dictum that communism is not a mere party doctrine of the working class, but a theory compassing the emancipation of society at large, including the capitalist class from its present narrow conditions. This is true enough in the abstract, but absolutely useless, and sometimes worse, in practice. So long as the wealthy classes not only do not feel the want of any emancipation, but strenuously oppose the self-emancipation of the working class, so long the social revolution will have to be prepared and fought out by the working class alone. The French bourgeois of 1789 too declared the emancipation of the bourgeoisie to be the emancipation of the whole human race. But the nobility and clergy would not see it. The proposition, though for the time being, with respect to feudalism and abstract historical truth, soon became a mere sentimentalism and disappeared from view altogether in the fire of the revolutionary struggle. And today, the very people who, from the impartiality of their superior standpoint, preach to the workers of socialism, soaring high above their class interests and class struggles, and tending to reconcile in a higher humanity the interests of both the contending classes, those people are either neophytes, who have still to learn a great deal, or they are the worst enemies of the workers, wolves in sheep's clothing. The recurring period of the great industrial crisis is stated in the text as 5 years. This was the period apparently indicated by the course of events from 1825 to 1842. But the industrial history from 1842 to 1868 has shown that the real period is one of 10 years, that the intermediate revulsions were secondary and tended more and more to disappear. Since 1868, the state of things has changed again, of which more anon. I have taken care not to strike out of the text of many prophecies, among others that of an imminent social revolution in England, which my youthful ardour induced me to venture upon. The wonder is, not that a good many of them proved wrong, but that so many of them have proved right, and that the critical state of English trade, to be brought on by continental and especially American competition, which I then foresaw, though in too short a period, has now actually come to pass. In this respect I can, and am bound to, bring the book up to date by placing here an article which I published in the London Commonweal on the 1st of March 1885 under the heading England in 1845 and in 1885. It gives at the same time a short outline of the history of the English working class during these 40 years and is as follows. 40 years ago, England stood face to face with a crisis, solvable to all appearances by force only. The immense and rapid development of manufactures had outstripped the extension of foreign markets and the increase of demand. Every 10 years, the march of industry was violently interrupted by a general commercial crash, followed, after a long period of quick depression, by a few short years of prosperity, and always ending in feverish overproduction and consequent renewed collapse. The capitalist class clamoured for free trade in corn, and threatened to enforce it by sending the starving population of the towns back to the country districts whence they came. To invade them, as John Bright said, not as paupers begging for bread, but as an army quartered upon the enemy. The working masses of the towns demanded their share of political power, the People's Charter. They were supported by the majority of the small trading class, and the only difference between the two was whether the charter should be carried by physical or by moral force. Then came the commercial crash of 1847 and the Irish famine, and with both the prospect of revolution. The French Revolution of 1848 saved the English middle class. The socialistic pronunciamentos of the victorious French workmen frightened the small middle class of England and disorganized the narrower, but more matter-of-fact movement of the English working class. At the very moment when Chartism was bound to assert itself in its full strength, it collapsed internally before even it collapsed externally on the 10th of April 1848. The action of the working class was thrust into the background. The capitalist class triumphed along the whole line. The Reform Bill of 1831 had been the victory of the whole capitalist class over the landed aristocracy. The repeal of the Corn Laws was the victory of the manufacturing capitalist, not only over the landed aristocracy, but over those sections of capitalists too, whose interests were more or less bound up with the landed interest: bankers, stock jobbers, fund holders, etc. Free trade meant the readjustment of the whole home and the foreign, commercial and financial policy of England in accordance with the interests of the manufacturing capitalists, the class which now represented the nation. And they set about this task with a will. Every obstacle to industrial production was mercilessly removed. The tariff and the whole system of taxation were revolutionized. Everything was made subordinate to one end, but that end of the utmost importance to the manufacturing capitalist: the cheapening of all raw produce and especially of the means of living of the working class, the reduction of the cost of raw material, and the bringing down, if not as yet, and the keeping down, if not as yet the bringing down of wages. England was to become the workshop of the world. All other countries were to become for England what Ireland already was: markets for her manufactured goods, supplying her in return with raw materials and food. England, the great manufacturing centre of an agricultural world, with an ever-increasing number of corn and cotton-growing Irelands revolving around her, the industrial sun. What a glorious prospect! The manufacturing capitalists set about the realisation of this, their great object, with that strong common sense and that contempt for traditional principles which has ever distinguished them from their more narrow-minded compeers on the continent. Chartism was dying out. The revival of commercial prosperity, natural after the revulsion of 1847 had spent itself, was put down altogether to the credit of free trade. Both these circumstances had turned the English working class politically into the tail of the great Liberal Party, the party led by the manufacturers. This advantage, once gained, had to be perpetuated. And the manufacturing capitalists, from the Chartist opposition, not to free trade, but to the transformation of free trade into the one vital national question, had learnt and were learning more and more that the middle class can never obtain full social and political power over the nation except by the help of the working class. Thus, a gradual change came over the relations between both classes. The Factory Acts, once the bugbear of all manufacturers, were not only willingly submitted to, but their expansion into acts regulating almost all trades was tolerated. Trade unions, hitherto considered inventions of the devil himself, were now petted and patronized as perfectly legitimate institutions, and as useful means of spreading sound economical doctrines among the workers. Even strikes, than which had been more nefarious areas up to 1848, were now gradually found out to be occasionally very useful, especially when provoked by the masters themselves at their own time. Of the legal enactments, placing the workman at a lower level or at a disadvantage with regard to the master, at least the most revolting were repealed. And practically, that horrid People's Charter actually became the political programme of the very manufacturers who had opposed it to the last. The abolition of the property qualification and vote by ballot are now the law of the land. The Reform Acts of 1867 and 1884 make a near approach to universal suffrage, at least such as it now exists in Germany. The Redistribution Bill now before Parliament creates equal electoral districts on the whole, not more unequal than those of Germany. Payment of members and shorter, if not actually annual parliaments, are visibly looming in the distance, and yet there are people who say that Chartism is dead. The Revolution of 1848, not less than many of its predecessors, has had strange bedfellows and successors. The very people who put it down have become, as Karl Marx used to say, its testamentary executors. Louis Napoleon had to create an independent and united Italy. Bismarck had to revolutionize Germany and to restore Hungarian independence, and the English manufacturers had to enact the People's Charter. For England, the effects of this domination of the manufacturing capitalists were at first startling. Trade revived and extended to a degree unheard of even in this cradle of modern industry. The previous astounding creations of steam and machinery dwindled into nothing compared with the immense massive productions of the 20 years from 1850 to 1870, with the overwhelming figures of exports and imports of wealth accumulated in the hands of capitalists and of human working power concentrated in the large towns. The progress was indeed interrupted, as before, by a crisis every 10 years, in 1857 as well as in 1866. But these revulsions were now considered as natural, inevitable events which must be fatalistically submitted to, and which always set themselves right in the end. And the condition of the working class during this period? There was temporary improvement even for the great mass. But this improvement always was reduced to the old level by the influx of the great body of the unemployed reserve, by the constant superseding of hands by new machinery, by the immigration of the agricultural population, now too more and more superseded by machines. A permanent improvement can be recognised for two protected sections only of the working class. Firstly, the factory hands. The fixing by Act of Parliament of their working day within relatively rational limits has restored their physical constitution and endowed them with a moral superiority, enhanced by their local concentration. They are undoubtedly better off than before 1848. The proof is that, and 10 strikes they make, 10 strikes are provoked by the manufacturers out of their own interests as the only means of securing a reduced production. You can never get the masters to agree to work short time. Let manufactured goods be ever so unsaleable, but get the work people to strike and the masters shut their factories to a man. Secondly, the great trade unions. They are the organizations of those trades in which the labor of grown-up men predominates, or is alone applicable. Here, the competition neither of men or of women and children nor of machinery has so far weakened their organized strength. The engineers, the carpenters and joiners, the bricklayers are each of them a power, to the extent that, as in the case of the bricklayers and bricklayers' labourers, they can even successfully resist the introduction of machinery. That their condition has remarkably improved since 1848, there can be no doubt. And the best proof of this is the fact that for more than 15 years, not only have their employers been with them, but they with their employers upon exceedingly good terms. They form an aristocracy among the working class. They have succeeded in enforcing for themselves a relatively comfortable position, and they accept it as final. They are the model working men of Messrs. Leone, Levi, and Giffen, and they are very nice people indeed nowadays to deal with, for any sensible capitalist in particular, and for the whole capitalist class in general. But as to the great mass of working people, the state of misery and insecurity in which they live now is as low as ever, if not lower. The East End of London is an ever-spreading pool of stagnant misery and desolation, of starvation when out of work, and degradation, physical and moral, when in work. And so in all other large towns. Abstraction made of the privileged minority of the workers, and so in the smaller towns and in the agricultural districts. The law which reduces the value of labour power to the value of the necessary means of subsistence, and the other law which reduces its average price as rule to the minimum of those means of subsistence, these laws act upon them with the irresistible force of an automatic engine which crushes them between its wheels. This, then, was the position created by the free trade policy of 1847 and by 20 years of the rule of the manufacturing capitalists. But then a change came. The crash of 1866 was indeed followed by a slight and short revival about 1873, but that did not last. We did not indeed pass through the full crisis at the time it was due in 1877 or 1878, but we have had, ever since 1876, a chronic state of stagnation in all dominant branches of industry. Neither will the full crash come, nor will the period of longed-for prosperity to which we used to be entitled before and after it. A dull depression, a chronic glut of all markets for all trades, that is what we have been living in for nearly 10 years. How is this? The free trade theory was based upon one assumption, that England was to be the one great manufacturing centre of an agricultural world. And the actual fact is that this assumption has turned out to be a pure delusion. The conditions of modern industry, steam power and machinery, can be established wherever there is fuel, especially coal. And other countries besides England, France, Belgium, Germany, America, even Russia, have coal. And the people over there did not see the advantage of being turned into Irish pauper farmers merely for the greater wealth and glory of English capitalists. They set resolutely about manufacturing, not only for themselves, but for the rest of the world. And the consequence is that the manufacturing monopoly enjoyed by England for nearly a century is irretrievably broken up. But the manufacturing monopoly of England is the pivot of the present social system of England. Even while that monopoly lasted, the markets could not keep pace with the increasing productivity of English manufacturers. The decennial crises were the consequence. And new markets are getting scarcer every day, so much so that even the, as it says here, Negroes of the Congo are now to be forced into the civilization attended upon Manchester calicos, Staffordshire pottery, and Birmingham hardware. How will it be when continental, and especially American, goods flow in ever-increasing quantities, when the predominant share, still held by British manufacturers, will become reduced from year to year? Answer: free trade, thou universal panacea. I am not the first to point this out. Already in 1883, at the South Board meeting of the British Association, Mr. Inglis Palgrave, the president of the economic section, stated plainly that the days of great trade efforts in England were over, and that there was a pause in the progress of several great branches of industrial labour. The country might almost be said to be entering the non-progressive state. But what is to be the consequence? Capitalist production cannot stop. It must go on increasing and expanding, or it must die. Even now, the mere reduction of England's lion's share of the supply of the world's markets means stagnation, distress, excessive capital here, excessive unemployed work people there. What will it be when the increase of yearly production is brought to a complete stop? Here is the vulnerable place, the heel of Achilles for capitalistic production. Its very basis is the necessity of constant expansion, and this constant expansion now becomes impossible. It ends in a deadlock. Every year, England is brought nearer face to face with the question: either the country must go to pieces, or capitalist production must. Which is it to be? And the working class? If even under the unparalleled commercial and industrial expansion from 1848 to 1868, they have had to undergo such misery, if even then the great bulk of them experienced at best but a temporary improvement of their condition, while only a small privileged protected minority was permanently benefited, what will it be when this dazzling period is brought finally to a close, when the present dreary stagnation shall not only become intensified, but this, its intensified condition, shall become the permanent and normal state of English trade? The truth is this: during the period of England's industrial monopoly, the English working class have to a certain extent shared in the benefits of the monopoly. These benefits were very unequally parcelled out among them. The privileged minority pocketed most, but even the great mass had at least a temporary share now and then. And that is the reason why, since the dying out of Owenism, there has been no socialism in England. With the breakdown of that monopoly, the English working class will lose that privileged position. It will find itself generally, the privileged and leading minority not accepted, on a level with its fellow workers abroad. And that is the reason why there will be why there will be socialism again in England. To this statement of the case, as that case appeared to me in 1885, I have but little to add. Needless to say that today there is indeed socialism again in England. And plenty of it, socialism of all shades. Socialism conscious and unconscious, socialism prosaic and poetic, socialism of the working class and of the middle class. For verily that abomination of abominations, socialism, has not only become respectable, but has actually donned evening dress and lounges lazily on drawing-room caucuses. That shows the incurable fickleness of that terrible despot of society, middle-class public opinion, and once more justifies the contempt in which we socialists of a past generation always held that public opinion. At the same time, we have no reason to grumble at the symptom itself. What I consider far more important than this momentary fashion among bourgeois circles of effecting a mild dilution of socialism, and even more than the actual progress of socialism has made in England generally, that is the revival of the East End of London. That immense haunt of misery is no longer the stagnant pool it was 6 years ago. It has shaken off its torpid despair, has returned to life, and has become the home of what is called the New Unionism. That is to say, of the organisation of the great mass of unskilled workers. This organisation may to a great extent adopt the form of the old unions of unskilled workers, but it is essentially different in character. The old unions preserve the traditions of the time when they were founded, and look upon the wages system as a once-for-all established, final fact which they at best can modify in the interests of their members. The new unions were founded at a time when the faith in the eternity of the wages system was severely shaken. Their founders and promoters were socialists, either consciously or by feeling. The masses whose adhesion gave them strength were rough, neglected, looked down upon by the working class aristocracy. But they had this immense advantage, that their minds were virgin soil, entirely free from the inherited, respectable bourgeois prejudices which hampered the brains of the better situated old unionists. And thus we see now these new unions taking the lead of the working class movement generally, and more taking in tow the rich and proud old unions. Undoubtedly, the East Enders have committed colossal blunders. So have their predecessors, and so do the doctrinaire socialists who pooh-pooh them. A large class, like a great nation, never learns better or quicker than by undergoing the consequences of its own mistakes. And for all the faults committed in past, present, and future, the revival of the East End of London remains one of the greatest and most fruitful facts of this fin de siècle, and glad and proud I am to have lived to see it. Friedrich Engels, 11th of January, 1892. Okay, so we're into the book proper now. Introduction. These inventions gave rise, as is well known, to an industrial revolution, a revolution which altered the whole of civil society, one the historical importance of which is only now beginning to be recognized. England is the classic soil of this transformation, which was all the mightier the more silently it proceeded. And England is therefore the classic land of its chief product also, the proletariat. Only in England can the proletariat be studied in all its relations and from all sides. We have not here and now to deal with the history of this revolution, nor with its vast importance for the present and the future. Such a delineation must be reserved for a future more comprehensive work. For the moment, we must limit ourselves to the little that is necessary for understanding the facts that follow, for comprehending the present state of the English proletariat. Before the introduction of machinery, the spinning and weaving of raw materials was carried on in the working man's home. Wife and daughter spun the yarn that the father wove up, or that they sold, if he did not work it up himself. These weaver families lived in the country in the neighbourhood of the towns and could get on fairly well with their wages, because the home market was almost the only one, and the crushing power of competition that came later, with the conquest of foreign markets and the extension of trade, did not yet press upon wages. There was, further, a constant increase in the demand for the home market, keeping pace with the slow increase in population and employing all the workers. And there was also the impossibility of vigorous competition of the workers among themselves, consequent upon the rural dispersion of their homes. So it was that the weaver was usually in a position to lay by something, and rent a little piece of land that he cultivated in his leisure hours, of which he had as many as he chose to take, since he could weave whenever and as long as he pleased. True, he was a bad farmer and managed his land inefficiently, often obtaining but poor crops. Nevertheless, he was no proletarian. He had a stake in the country, he was permanently settled, and stood one step higher in society than the English workman of today. So the workers vegetated throughout a possibly comfortable existence, leading a righteous and peaceful life in all piety and probity, and their material position was far better than that of their successors. They did not need to overwork. They did no more than they chose to do, and yet earned what they needed. They had leisure for healthful work in garden or field, work which, in itself, was recreation for them, and they could take part besides in the recreations and games of their neighbours, and all these games, bowling, cricket, football, etc., contributed to their physical health and vigour. They were, for the most part, strong, well-built people, in whose physique little or no difference from that of their peasant neighbours was discoverable. Their children grew up in the fresh country air, and if they could help their parents at work, it was only occasionally. While of 8 or 12 hours work for them, there was no question. What the moral and intellectual character of this class was may be guessed. Shut off from the towns, which they never entered, their yarn and woven stuff being delivered to travelling agents for payment of wages, so shut off that old people who lived quite in the neighbourhood of the town never went thither until they were robbed of their trade by the introduction of machinery, and obliged to look about them in the towns for work. The weavers stood upon the moral and intellectual plane of the yeomen, with whom they were usually immediately connected through their little holdings. They regarded their squire, the greatest landholder of the region, as their natural superior. They asked advice of him, laid their small disputes before him for settlement, and gave him all honour as this patriarchal relation prescribed. They were respectable people, good husbands and fathers, that moralized because they had no temptation to be immoral, there being no groggeries or low houses in their vicinity, and because the host, at whose inn they now and then quenched their thirst, was also a respectable man, usually a large tenant farmer, who took pride in his good order, good beer, and early hours. They had their children the whole day at home, and brought them up in obedience and the fear of God. The patriarchal relationship remained undisturbed so long as the children were unmarried. The young people grew up in idyllic simplicity and intimacy with their playmates until they married. And even though sexual intercourse before marriage almost unfailingly took place, this happened only when the moral obligation of marriage was recognized on both sides and a subsequent wedding made everything good. In short, the English industrial workers of those days lived and fought after the fashion still to be found here and there in Germany, in retirement and seclusion, without mental activity and without violent fluctuations in their position in life. They could rarely read and far more rarely write, went regularly to church, never talked politics, never conspired, never thought, delighted in physical exercises, listened with inherited reverence to the Bible when the Bible was read, and were, in their unquestioning humility, exceedingly well disposed towards the superior classes. But intellectually, they were dead. Lived only for their petty private interests, for their looms and gardens, and knew nothing of the mighty movement which, beyond their horizon, was sweeping through mankind. They were comfortable in their silent vegetation, and but for the Industrial Revolution they would never have emerged from this existence, which, cosily romantic as it was nevertheless not worthy of human beings. In truth, they were not human beings. They were merely toiling machines in the service of the few aristocrats who had guided history down to that time. The Industrial Revolution has simply carried this out to its logical end by making the workers' machines pure and simple, taking from them the last trace of independent activity, and so forcing them to think and demand a position worthy of men. As in France politics, so in England manufacture, and the movement of civil society in general drew into the whirl of history the last classes which had remained sunk in apathetic indifference to the universal interests of mankind. The first invention which gave rise to a radical change in the state of the English workers was the jenny, invented in the year 1764 by a weaver, James Hargreaves of Standhill near Blackburn in North Lancashire. This machine was the rough beginning of the later invented mule, and was worked by hand. Instead of one spindle like the ordinary spinning wheel, it carried 16 or 18 manipulated by a single workman. This invention made it possible to deliver more yarn than heretofore. Whereas, though one weaver had employed 3 spinners, there had never been enough yarn, and the weaver had often been obliged to wait for it. There was now more yarn to be had than could be woven by the available workers. The demand for woven goods, already increasing, rose yet more in consequence of the cheapness of these goods, which cheapness in turn was the outcome of the diminished cost of producing the yarn. More weavers were needed, and weavers' wages rose. Now that the weaver could earn more at his loom, he gradually abandoned his farming and gave his whole time to weaving. At that time, a family of 4 grown persons and 2 children, who were set to spooling, could earn, with 10 hours daily work, £4 in a week, and often more if trade was good and work pressed. It happened often enough that a single weaver earned £2 a week at his loom. By degrees, the class of farming weavers wholly disappeared, and was merged in the newly arising class of weavers who lived wholly upon wages, had no property whatever, not even the pretended property of a holding, and so became working men proletarians. Moreover, the old relation between spinner and weaver was destroyed. Hitherto, so far as this has been possible, yarn had been spun and woven under one roof. Now that the jenny, as well as the loom, required a strong hand, men began to spin, and the whole families lived by spinning, while others laid the antiquated, superseded spinning wheel aside, and if they had not the means of purchasing a jenny, were forced to live upon the wages of the father alone. Thus began with spinning and weaving that division of labour which has since been so infinitely perfected. While the individual proletariat was thus developing with the first, still very imperfect machine, the same machine gave rise to the agricultural proletariat. There had hitherto been a vast number of small landowners, yeomen, who had vegetated in the same unthinking quiet as their neighbours, the farming weavers. They cultivated their scraps of land quite after the ancient and inefficient fashion of their ancestors, and opposed every change with the obstinacy peculiar to such creatures of habit, after remaining stationary from generation to generation. Among them were many smallholders also, not tenants in the present sense of the word, but people who held land handed down from their fathers, either by hereditary lease or by force of ancient custom, and had hitherto held it as securely as if it had actually been their own property. When the agricultural workers withdrew from agriculture, and the industrial workers, a great number of small holdings fell idle, and upon these a new class of large tenants established themselves, tenants at will, holding 50, 100, 200 or more acres, liable to be turned out at the end of the year, but able by improved tillage and larger farming to increase the yield of the land. They could sell their produce more cheaply than the gameman, for whom nothing remained when his farm no longer supported him but to sell it, procure a jenny or loom, or take service as an agricultural labourer in the employ of a large farmer. His inherited slowness and the inefficient methods of cultivation bequeathed by his ancestors and above which he could not rise left him no alternative when forced to compete with men who managed their holdings on sounder principles and before the advantages bestowed by fanning on a large scale and the investment of capital for the improvement of the soil. Meanwhile, the industrial movement did not stop here. Single capitalists began to set up spinning jennies in great buildings and to use water power for driving them, so placing themselves in a position to diminish the number of workers and sell their yarn more cheaply than single spinners could do who worked their own machines by hand. There were constant improvements in the jenny so that machines continually became antiquated and must be altered or even laid aside. And though the capitalists could hold out by the application of water power even with the old machinery, for the single spinner this was impossible. And the factory system, the beginning of which was thus made, received a fresh extension in 1767, although the spinning throstle invented by Richard Arkwright, a barber in Preston, North Lancashire. After the steam engine, this is the most important mechanical invention of the 18th century. It was calculated from the beginning for mechanical motive power and was based upon wholly new principles. By the combination of the peculiarities of the jenny and the throstle, Samuel Crompton of Furwood, Lancashire, contrived the mule in 1785, and as Arkwright invented the carding machine and preparatory, slobbing and roving, frames about the same time, the factory system became the prevailing one for the spinning of cotton. By means of trifling modifications, these machines were gradually adapted for the spinning of wool, and later, in the first decade of the present century, also of flax, and so to the superseding of handwork here too. But even then, the end was not yet. In the closing years of the last century, Dr. Cartwright, a country parson, had invented the power loom, and about 1804 had so far perfected it that it could be successfully compete with the hand weaver, and all this machinery was made doubly important by with these inventions, since improved from year to year, the victory of machine work over handwork in the chief branches of English industry was won, and the history of the latter from that time forward simply relates how the handworkers have been driven by machinery from one position after another. The consequences of this were, on the one hand, a rapid fall in price of all manufactured commodities, prosperity of commerce and manufacture, the conquest of nearly all the unprotected. On the other hand, a still more rapid multiplication of the proletariat, the destruction of all property holding and of all security of employment for the working class, demoralization, political excitement, and all those facts so highly repugnant to Englishmen in comfortable circumstances, which we shall have to consider in the following pages. Having already seen what a transformation in the social condition of the lower classes a single such clumsy machine as the jenny had wrought, there is no cause for surprise. Machinery which receives raw material and turns out woven goods. Meanwhile, let us trace the development of English manufacture somewhat more minutely, beginning with the cotton industry. In the years 1771 to 75, there were annually imported into England rather less than 5 million pounds of raw cotton. In the year 1841, there were imported 528 million pounds, and the import for 1844 will reach at least 600 million pounds. In 1834, England exported 556 million yards of woven cotton goods, 76,500,000 pounds of cotton yarn, and cotton hosiery of the value of 1,200,000 pounds. In the same year, over 8 million mule spindles were at work, 110,000 power and 250,000 hand looms, throstle spindles not included, in the service of the cotton industry. And according to McCulloch's reckoning, nearly 1.5 million human beings were supported by this branch, of whom but 220,000 worked in the mills. The power used in these mills was steam, equivalent to 33,000 horsepower, and water, equivalent to 11,000 horsepower. At present, these figures are far from adequate, and it may be safely assumed that in the year 1845 the power and number of the machines and the number of the workers are greater by one half than in 1834. The chief centre of this industry is Lancashire, where it originated. It has thoroughly revolutionised this county, taking it from an obscure, ill-cultivated swamp into a busy, lively region, multiplying its population tenfold in 80 years and causing giant cities such as Liverpool and Manchester, containing together 700,000 inhabitants, and their neighbouring towns Bolton with 60,000, Rochdale with 75,000, Oldham with 50,000, Preston with 60,000, Ashton and Stalybridge with 40,000, and a whole list of other manufacturing towns to spring up as if by a magic touch. The history of South Lancashire contains some of the greatest marvels of modern times, yet no one ever mentions them, and all these miracles are the product of the cotton industry. Glasgow, too, the centre for the cotton district of Scotland for Lanarkshire and Renfrewshire, has increased in population from 30,000 to 300,000 since the introduction of the industry. The hosiery manufacture of Nottingham and Derby also received one fresh impulse from the lower price of yarn, and a second one from an improvement in the stocking loom, by means of which two stockings could be woven at once. The manufacture of lace, too, became an important branch of industry after the invention of the lace machine in 1777. Soon after that date, Lindley invented the point net machine, and in 1809 Heathcote invented the bobbin set machine, in consequence of which the production of lace was greatly simplified and the demand increased proportionately in consequence of the diminished cost. So that now, at least 200,000 persons are supported by this industry. Its chief centres are Nottingham, Leicester, and the west of England, Wiltshire, Devonshire, etc. A corresponding extension has taken place in the branches development dependent upon the cotton industry, in dyeing, bleaching, and printing. Bleaching by the application of chlorine in place of oxygen in the atmosphere, dyeing and printing by the rapid development of chemistry, and printing by a series of most brilliant mechanical inventions were a yet greater advance which, with the extension of these branches caused by the growth of the cotton industry, raised them to a previously unknown degree of prosperity. The same activity manifested itself in the manufacture of wool. This had hitherto been the leading department of English industry, but the quantities formerly produced are as no comparison with that which is now manufactured. In 1782, the whole wool crop of the preceding 3 years lay unused for want of workers, and would have continued so to lie if the newly invented machinery had not come to its assistance and spun it. The adaptation of this machinery to the spinning of wool was most successfully accomplished. Then began the same sudden development in the wool districts which we have already seen in the cotton districts. In 1738 there were 75, 1817 there were 490,000 pieces, and so it was the extension of the industry that in 1834, 450,000 more pieces were produced than in 1825. In 1801, 101 million pounds of wool, 7 million pounds of it imported, were worked up. In 1835, 180 million pounds were worked up, of which 42 million pounds were imported. The principal centre of this industry is the West Riding of Yorkshire, where, especially at Bradford, long English wool is converted into worsted yarns, etc. While in the other cities, Leeds, Halifax, Huddersfield, etc., short wool is converted into hard-spun yarn and cloth. Then come the adjacent part of Lancashire, the region of Rochdale, where in addition to the cotton industry, much flannel is produced, and the west of England, which supplies the finest cloths. Here also the growth of population is worthy of observation. Bradford contained 29,000. Into a table. It's a bit confusing to read out. Population which since 1831 must have increased at least 20-25% and further. In 1835, the spinning of wool employed in the United Kingdom 1,313 mills with 71,300 workers. These last being but a small portion of the multitude who are supported directly or indirectly by the manufacture of wool, and excluding nearly all weavers. Progress in the linen trade developed later, because the nature of the raw material made the application of spinning machinery very difficult. Attempts had been made in the last years of the last century in Scotland, but the Frenchman Girard, who introduced flax spinning in 1810, was the first who succeeded practically, and even Girard's machines first attained on British soil the importance they deserved by means of improvements which they underwent in England, and of their universal application in Leeds, Dundee, and Belfast. From this time, the British linen trade rapidly extended. In 1814, 3,000 tons of flax were imported. In 1833, nearly 19,000 tons of flax, and 3,400 tons of hemp. The export of Irish linen to Great Britain rose from 32 million yards in 1800 to 53 million in 1825, of which a large part was re-exported. The export of English and Scotch woven linen goods rose from 24 million yards in 1820 to 51 million yards in 1833. The number of flax spinning establishments in 1835 was 347, employing 33,000 workers. One half of them were in the south of Scotland, more than 60 in the West Riding of Yorkshire, Leeds and its environs, 25 in Belfast, Ireland, and the rest in Dorset and Lancashire. Weaving is carried on in the south of Scotland, here and there in England, but principally in Ireland. With like success did the English turn their attention to the manufacture of silk. Raw material was imported from southern Europe and Asia ready spun, and the chief labour lay in the twisting of fine threads. Until 1824, the heavy import duty, 4 shillings per pound on raw material, greatly retarded the development of the English silk industry, while only the markets of England and the colonies were protected for it. In that year, the duty was reduced to 1 penny, and the number of mills at once largely increased. In a single year, the number of furring spindles rose from 780,000 to 1,180,000. And although the commercial crisis of 1825 crippled this branch of industry for the moment, yet in 1827 more was produced than ever. The mechanical skill and experience of the English having secured their twisting machinery the supremacy over the awkward devices of their competitors. In 1835, Britain possessed 260 free working mills, employing 30,000 workers, located chiefly in Cheshire, in Macclesfield, Congleton, and the surrounding districts, and in Manchester and Somersetshire. Besides these, there are numerous mills for working up waste, from which a particular article known as spun silk is manufactured, with which the English supply even the Paris and Lyons weavers. The weaving of the silk so twisted and spun is carried on in Paisley and elsewhere in Scotland, and in Spitalfields, London, but also in Manchester and elsewhere. Nor is the gigantic advance achieved in English manufacture since 1760 restricted to the production of clothing materials. The impulse once given was communicated to all branches of industrial activity, and a multitude of inventions, wholly unrelated to those here cited, received double importance from the fact that they were made in the midst of the universal movement. But as soon as the immeasurable importance of mechanical power was practically demonstrated, every energy was concentrated on the effort to exploit this power in all directions, and to exploit it in the interest of individual inventors and manufacturers. And the demand for machinery, fuel, and materials called a mass of workers and the number of trades into redoubled activity. The steam engine first gave importance to the broad coalfields of England. The production of machinery began now for the first time, and with it arose a new interest in the iron mines which supplied raw material for it. The increased consumption of wool stimulated English sheep breeding, and the growing importation of wool, flax, and silk called forth an extension of the British ocean-carrying trade. Greatest of all was the growth of the production of iron. The rich iron deposits of the English hills had hitherto been little developed. Iron had always been smelted by means of charcoal, which became gradually more expensive as agriculture improved and forests were cut away. The beginning of the use of coke in iron smelting had been made in the last century, and in 1780 a new method was invented of converting into available wrought iron coke smelting iron, which up to that time had been convertible into cast iron only. This process, known as puddling, consisted in withdrawing the carbon which had mixed with the iron during the process of smelting, and opened a wholly new field for the production of English iron. Smelting furnaces were built 50 times larger than before, the process of smelting was simplified by the introduction of hot blasts, and iron could thus be produced so cheaply that a multitude of objects which had before been made of stone or wood were now made of iron. In 1788, Thomas Paine, the famous Democrat, built in Yorkshire the first iron bridge, which was followed by a great number of others, so that now nearly all bridges, especially for railroad traffic, are built of cast iron, while in London itself, a bridge across the Thames, the Southwark Bridge, has been built of this material. Iron pillars, supports for machinery, etc. are universally used, and with the introduction of gas lighting and railroads, new outlets for English iron products are opened. Nails and screws gradually came to be made by machinery. Huntsman, a Sheffielder, discovered in 1760 a method for casting steel by which much labour was saved, and the production of wholly new cheap goods rendered practicable. And through the greater purity of the material placed at its disposal and more perfect tools, New machinery and minute division of labour, the metal trade of England now first gained importance. The population of Birmingham grew from 773,000 in 1801 to 200,000 in 1844. That of Sheffield from 46,000 in 1801 to 110,000 in 1844. And the consumption of coal in the latter city alone reached in 1836 515,000 tons. In 1805 there were exported 4,300 tons of iron products and 4,600 tons of pig iron. In 1834, 16,200 tons of iron products and 107,000 tons of pig iron, while the whole iron product reaching in 1740 but 17,000 tons had risen in 1834 to nearly 700,000 tons. The smelting of pig iron alone consumes yearly more than 3 million tons of coal, and the importance which coal mining has attained in the course of the last 60 years can scarcely be conceived. All the English and Scotch deposits are now worked, and the mines of Northumberland and Durham alone yield annually more than 5 million tons for shipping and employ from 40 to 50,000 men. According to the Durham Chronicle, there were worked in these two counties. In 1753, 14 mines; in 1800, 40 mines. In 1836, 76 mines. In 1843, 130 mines. Moreover, all mines are now much more energetically worked than formerly. A similarly increased activity developed in the working of tin, copper, and lead, and alongside the extension of glass manufacture arose a new branch industry in the production of pottery, rendered important by the efforts of Josiah Wedgwood about 1763. This inventor placed the whole manufacture of stoneware on a scientific basis, introduced better taste, and founded the potteries of North Staffordshire, a district of 8 English miles square, which formerly a desert waste is now sown with works and dwellings and supports more than 60,000 people. Into this universal well of activity, everything was drawn. Agriculture made a corresponding advance. Not only did landed property pass, as we have already seen, into the hands of new owners and cultivators, agriculture was affected in still another way. The great holders applied capital to the improvement of the soil, tore down needless fences, drained, manured, employed better tools, and applied a rotation of crops. The progress of science came to their assistance too, also. Sir Humphrey Davy applied chemistry to agriculture with success, and the development of agriculture science bestowed a multitude of advantages upon the large farmer. Further, in consequence of the increase in population, the demand for agricultural products increased in such measure that from 1760 to 1834, 6,840,540 acres of wasteland were reclaimed. And in spite of this, England was transformed from a grain exporting to a grain importing country. The same activity developed in the establishment of communication. From 1818 to 1829, there were built in England and Wales 1,000 English miles of roadway of the width prescribed by law, 60 feet, and nearly all the old roads were reconstructed on the new system of macadam. In Scotland, the Department of Public Works has built since 1803 nearly 9,000 miles of roadway and more than 1,000 bridges, by which the population of the Highlands was suddenly placed within reach of civilization. The Highlanders had hitherto been chiefly poachers and smugglers, and they now became farmers and handworkers. And, though Gaelic schools were organised for the purpose of maintaining the Gaelic language, yet Gaelic, Celtic customs and speech are rapidly vanishing before the approach of English civilization. So too in Ireland. Between the counties of Cork, Limerick and Kerry lay hitherto a wilderness wholly without possible roads, and serving, by reason of inaccessibility, as the refuge of all criminals and the chief protection of the Celtic Irish nationality in the south of Ireland. It has now been cut through by public roads, and a civilization has thus gained admission even to this savage region. The whole of the British Isles, and especially England, which 60 years ago had as bad roads in Germany, or France then had, is now covered by a network of the finest roadways, and these two, like almost everything else in England, are the work of private enterprise, the state having done very little in this direction. Before 1755, England possessed almost no canals. In that year, a canal was built in Lancashire from Sankey Brook to St Helens, and in 1759, James Brindley built the first important one, the Duke of Bridwater's Canal from Manchester, and the coal mines of the district to the mouth of the Mersey passing, near Barton, by aqueduct over the River Irwell. From this achievement dates the canal building of England, to which Brindley first gave importance. Canals were now built, and rivers made navigable in all directions. In England alone, there are 2,200 miles of canals and 1,800 miles of navigable river. In Scotland, the Caledonian Canal was cut directly across the country, and in Ireland several canals were built. These improvements too, like the railroads and roadways, are nearly all the work of private individuals and companies. The railroads have been only recently built. The first great one was opened from Liverpool to Manchester in 1830, since when all the great cities have been connected by rail. London with Southampton, Brighton, Dover, Colchester, Exeter and Birmingham, Birmingham with Gloucester, Liverpool, Lancaster, via Newton and Wigan, and via Manchester and Bolton. Also with Leeds, via Manchester and Halifax, and via Leicester, Derby and Sheffield. Leeds with Hull and Newcastle via York. There are also many minor lines building or projected, which will soon make it possible to travel from Edinburgh to London in one day. As it had transformed the means of communication by land, so did the introduction of steam revolutionise travel by sea. The first steamboat was launched in 1807 in the Hudson, North America, the first in the British Empire, and in 1811 on the Clyde. Since then, more than 600 have been built in England, and in 1836, more than 500 were plying to and from British ports. Such, in brief, is the history of English industrial development in the past 60 years, a history which has no counterpart in the annals of humanity. 60, 80 years ago, England was a country like every other, with small towns, few and simple industries, and a thin but proportionately large agricultural population. Today it is a country like no other, with a capital of 2.5 million inhabitants, with vast manufacturing cities, with an industry that supplies the world and produces almost everything by means of the most complex machinery, with an industrious, intelligent, dense population, of which 2/3 are employed in trade and commerce, and composed of classes wholly different, forming, in fact, with other customs and other needs, a different nation from the England of those days. The Industrial Revolution is of the same importance for England as the political revolution for France, and the philosophical revolution for Germany. And the difference between England in 1760 and in 1844 is at least as great as that between France under the Ancien Regime and during the Revolution of July. But the mightiest result for this industrial transformation is the English proletariat. We have already seen how the proletariat was called into existence by the introduction of machinery. The rapid extension of manufacture demanded hands, wages rose, and troops of workmen migrated from the agricultural districts to the towns. Population multiplied enormously, and nearly all the increase took place in the proletariat. Further, Ireland had entered upon an orderly development only since the beginning of the 18th century. There too, the population, more than decimated by English cruelty and earlier disturbances, now rapidly multiplied, especially after the advance in manufacture began to draw masses of Irishmen towards England. Thus arose the great manufacturing and commercial sites of the British Empire, to which at least 3/4 of the population belong to the working class, while the lower middle class consists only of small shopkeepers and very, very few handicraftsmen. For, though rising manufacture first attained importance by transforming tools into machines, workrooms into factories, and consequently the toiling lower middle class into the toiling proletariat, and the former large merchants into manufacturers, though the lower middle class was thus early crushed out, and the population reduced to the two opposing elements, workers and capitalists, this happened outside of the domain of manufacture proper, in the province of handicraft and the retail trade as well. In the place of the former masters and apprentices came great capitalists and working men who had no prospect of rising above their class. Handwork was carried on after the fashion of factory work, the division of labour was strictly applied, and small employers who could not compete with great establishments were forced down into the proletariat. At the same time, the destruction of the former organisation of handwork and the disappearance of the lower middle class deprived the working man of all possibility of rising into the middle class himself. Hitherto, he had always had the prospect of establishing himself somewhere as master artificer, perhaps employing journeymen and apprentices, but now, when master artificers were crowded out by the manufacturers, when large capital had become necessary for carrying on work independently, the working class became, for the first time, an integral permanent class of the population, whereas it had formerly often been merely a transition leading to the bourgeoisie. Now he who was born to toil had no other prospect than that of remaining a toiler all his life. Now, for the first time, therefore, the proletariat was in a position to undertake an independent movement. In this way were brought together those vast masses of working men who now fill the whole of Britain, whose social condition forces itself every day more and more upon the attention of the civilized world. The condition of the working class is the condition of the vast majority of England and English people. The question: what is to become of those destitute millions, who consume today what they earned yesterday, who have created the greatness of England by their inventions and their toil, who become with every passing day more conscious of their might, and demand, with daily increasing urgency, their share of the advantages of society. This, since the Reform Bill, has become the national question. All parliamentary debates of any importance may be reduced to this. And though the English middle class will not as yet admit it, though they try to evade this great question and to represent their own particular interests as the truly national ones, their attitude is utterly useless. With every session of Parliament, the working class gains ground, the interests of the middle class diminish in importance. And in spite of the fact that the middle class is the chief, in fact the only power in Parliament, the last session of 1844 was a continuous debate upon subjects affecting the working class. The Poor Relief Bill, the Factory Act, the Masters and Servants Act, and Thomas Duncan, the representative of the working men in the House of Commons, was the great man of the session, while the liberal middle class, with its motion for repealing corn laws, and the radical middle class, with its resolution for refusing the taxes, played pitiable roles. Even the debates about Ireland were at bottom debates about the Irish proletariat, and the means of coming to its assistance. It is high time, too, for the English middle class to make some concessions to the working men who no longer plead but threaten, for in a short time it may be too late. In spite of all this, the English middle class, especially the manufacturing class, which is enriched directly by the poverty of the workers, persists in ignoring this poverty. This class, feeling itself the mighty representative class of the nation, is ashamed to lay the sore spot of England bare before the eyes of the world, will not confess even to itself that the workers are in distress, because it, the property-holding manufacturing class, must bear the moral responsibility for this distress. Hence the scornful smile which intelligent Englishmen, and they, the middle class, alone are known on the continent, assume when anyone begins to speak of the condition of the working class. Hence the utter ignorance on the part of the whole middle class of everything which concerns the workers. Hence the ridiculous blunders which men of this class, in and out of Parliament, make when the position of the proletariat comes under discussion. Hence the absurd freedom from anxiety, with which the middle class dwells upon a soil that is honeycombed, and may any day collapse, the speedy collapse of which is as certain as a mathematical or mechanical demonstration. Hence the miracle that the English have as yet no single book upon the condition of their workers, although they have been examining and amending the old state of things, no one knows how many years. Hence also the deep wrath of the whole working class, from Glasgow to London, against the rich, by whom they are systematically plundered and mercilessly left to their fate. A wrath which, before too long a time goes by, a time almost within the power of man to predict, must break out into a revolution in comparison with which the French Revolution and the year 1794 will prove to have been child's play. Okay, I'm just going to duplicate my first little. Thanks, husband. And thank you, Mommy Diane. Good to see you tuning in. I'm just going to move this in a little. That'll make it easier to hear me. Okay. Let's continue. So, on to the industrial proletariat. The order of our investigation of the different sections of the proletariat follows naturally from the foregoing history of its rise. The first proletarians were connected with manufacture, were engendered by it, and accordingly those employed in manufacture, in the working up of raw materials, will first claim our attention. The production of raw materials and of fuel for manufacture attained importance only in consequence of the industrial change, and engendered a new proletariat, the coal and metal miners. Then, in the third place, manufacture influenced agriculture, and in the fourth, the condition of Ireland. And the fractions of the proletariat belonging to each will find their place accordingly. We shall find too that, with the possible exception of the Irish, the degree of intelligence of the various workers is in direct proportion to their relation to manufacture, and that the factory hands are the most enlightened as to their own interests. The miners somewhat less so, the agricultural labourers scarcely at all. We shall find the same order again among the industrial workers, and shall see how the factory hands, eldest children of the Industrial Revolution, have, from the beginning to the present day, formed the nucleus of the labour movement, and how the others have joined this movement, just in proportion as their handicraft has been invaded by the progress of machinery. We shall thus learn from the example which England offers, from the equal pace which the labour movement has kept with the movement of industrial development, the historical significance of manufacture. Since, however, at the present moment, pretty much the whole industrial proletariat is involved in the movement, and the condition of these separate sections has much in common, because they all are industrial, we shall have first to examine the condition of the industrial proletariat as a whole, in order later to notice more particularly each separate division with its own peculiarities. It has already suggested that manufacture centralizes property in the hands of the few. It requires large capital with which to erect the colossal establishments that ruin the petty trading bourgeoisie, and with which to press into its service the forces of nature, so driving the hand labour of the independent workman out of the market. The division of labour, the application of water and especially steam, and the application of the machinery are the three great levers with which manufacture, since the beginning of the last century, has been busy putting the world out of joint. Manufacture on a small scale created the middle class. On a large scale, it created the working class, and raised the elect of the middle class to the throne, but only to overthrow them the more surely when the time comes. Meanwhile, it is an undenied and easily explained fact that the numerous petty middle class of the good old times has been annihilated by manufacture, and resolved into rich capitalists on the one hand and poor workers on the other. The centralizing tendency of manufacture does not, however, stop here. Population becomes centralized just as capital does, and very naturally, since the human being, the worker, is regarded in manufacture simply as a piece of capital for the use of which the manufacturer pays interest under the name of wages. A manufacturing establishment requires many workers employed together in a single building, living near each other and forming a village of themselves in the case of a good-sized factory. They have needs for satisfying which other people are necessary. Handicraftsmen, shoemakers, tailors, bakers, carpenters, stonemasons settle at hand. The inhabitants of the village, especially the younger generation, accustom themselves to factory work, grow skillful in it, and when the first mill can no longer employ them all, wages fall, and the immigration of fresh workers is the consequence. So the village grows into a small town, and the small town into a large one. The greater the town, the greater its advantages. It offers roads, railroads, canals. The choice of skilled labour increases constantly. New establishments can be built more cheaply because of the competition among builders and machinists who are at hand than in remote country districts, whither timber, machinery, builders, and operatives must be bought. It offers a market to which buyers crowd and direct communication with the markets supplying raw material or demanding finished goods. Hence the marvellously rapid growth of the great manufacturing towns. The country, on the other hand, has the advantage that wages are usually lower than in town, and so town and country are in constant competition. And if the advantage is on the side of the town today, wages sink so low in the country tomorrow that new investments are most profitably made there. But the centralizing tendency of manufacture continues in full force, and every new factory built in the country bears in it the germ of a manufacturing town. If it were possible for this mad rush of manufacture to go on at this rate for another century, every manufacturing district of England would be one great manufacturing town, and Manchester and Liverpool would meet at Warrington or Newton, for in commerce too, this centralization of the population works in precisely the same way, and hence it is that a few great harbours, such as Hull and Liverpool, Bristol and London, monopolise almost the whole maritime commerce of Great Britain. Since commerce and manufacture attained their most complete development in these great towns, their influence upon the proletariat is also most clearly observable here. Here, the centralization of property has reached the highest point. Here, the morals and customs of the good old times are most completely obliterated. Here it has gone so far that the name Merry Old England itself conveys no meaning, for Old England itself is unknown to memory and to the tales of our grandfathers. Hence, too, there exists here only a rich and a poor class, for the lower middle class vanishes more completely with every passing day. Thus, the class formerly most stable has become the most restless one. It consists today of a few remnants of a past time, and a number of people eager to make fortunes, industrial microbers and speculators of whom one may amass a fortune, while 99 become insolvent, and more than half of the 99 live in perpetually repeated failure. But in these towns, the proletarians are the infant majority, and how they fare, what influence the great town exercises upon them, we have now to investigate. The great towns. A town, such as London, where a man may wander for hours together without reaching the beginning of the end, without meeting the slightest hint which could lead to the inference that there is open country within reach, is a strange thing. This colossal centralization, this heaping together of 2.5 millions of human beings at one point, has multiplied the power of this 2.5 millions 100-fold, has raised London to the commercial capital of the world, created the giant docks and assembled the 1,000 vessels that continually cover the Thames. I know nothing more imposing than the view which the Thames offers during the ascent from the sea to London Bridge. The masses of buildings, the wharves on both sides, especially from Woolwich upwards, the countless ships along both shores, crowding ever closer and closer together, until at last only a narrow passage remains in the middle of the river, a passage through which hundreds of steamers shoot one another. All this so vast, so impressive that a man cannot collect himself, but is lost in the marvel of England's greatness before he sets foot upon English soil. But the sacrifices which all this has cost become apparent later. After roaming the streets of the capital a day or two, making headway with difficulty through the human turmoil and the endless lines of vehicles, after visiting the slums of the metropolis, one realizes for the first time that these Londoners have been forced to sacrifice the best qualities of their human nature, to bring to pass all the marvels of civilization which crown their city, that 100 powers which slumbered within them have remained inactive, have been suppressed in order that a few might be developed more fully and multiply through union with those of others. The very turmoil of the streets has something repulsive, something against which human nature rebels. The hundreds of thousands of all classes and ranks crowding past each other, are they not all human beings with the same qualities and powers and of the same interest in being happy? And have they not in the end to seek happiness in the same way by the same means? And still they crowd by one another as though they had nothing in common, nothing to do with one another, and their only agreement is the tacit one, that each keep to his own side of the pavement, so as not to delay the opposing streams of the crowd, while it occurs to no man to honour another with so much as a glance. The brutal indifference, the unfeeling isolation of each in his private interest, becomes the more repellent and offensive, the more these individuals are crowded together within a limited space. And, however much one may be aware that this isolation of the individual, this narrow self-seeking, is the fundamental principle of our society everywhere, it is nowhere so shamelessly barefaced, so self-conscious, as just here in the crowding of the great city. The dissolution of mankind into monads, of which each one has a separate essence and a separate purpose, the world of atoms, is here carried out to its utmost extreme. Hence it comes too that the social war, the war of each against all, is here openly declared. Just as in Stirner's recent book, people regard each other only as useful objects. Each exploits the other, and the end of it all is that the stronger treads the weaker underfoot, and that the powerful few, the capitalists, seize everything for themselves, while to the weak many, the poor, scarcely a bare existence remains. What is true of London is true of Manchester, Birmingham, Leeds, is true of all great towns. Everywhere barbarous indifference, hard egotism on one hand, and nameless misery on the other. Everywhere social warfare, every man's house in a state of siege, everywhere reciprocal plundering under the protection of the law, and all so shameless, so openly avowed that one shrinks before the consequences of our social state as they manifest themselves here undisguised, and can only wonder that the whole crazy fabric still hangs together. Since capital, the direct or indirect control of the means of subsistence and production, is the weapon with which this social warfare is carried on, it is clear that all the disadvantages of such a state must fall upon the poor man. For him, no one has the slightest concern. Cast into the whirlpool, he must struggle through as well as he can. If he is so happy as to find work, i.e., if the bourgeoisie does him the favour to enrich himself by means of him, wages await him which scarcely suffice to keep body and soul together. If he can get no work, he may steal, if he is not afraid of the police, or starve, in which case the police will take care that he does so in a quiet and inoffensive manner. During my residence in England, at least 20 or 30 persons have died of simple starvation under the most revolting circumstances, and the jury has rarely been found possessed of the courage to speak the plain truth in the matter. Let the testimony of the witnesses be never so clear and unequivocal, the bourgeoisie from which the jury is selected always find some back door through which to escape the frightful verdict, death from starvation. The bourgeoisie dare not speak the truth in these cases, for it would speak its own condemnation. But indirectly, far more than directly, many have died of starvation, where a long-continued want of proper nourishment has called forth fatal illness, when it has produced such debility that causes which might otherwise have remained inoperative brought on severe illness and death. The English working men call this social murder and accuse our whole society of perpetuating this crime perpetually. Are they wrong? True, it is only individuals who starve, but what security has the working man that it may not be his turn tomorrow? Who assures him employment? Who vouches for it that, if for any reason or no reason his lord and master discharges him tomorrow, he can struggle along with those dependent upon him, until he may find someone else to give him bread? Who guarantees that willingness to work shall suffice to obtain work, that uprightness, industry, thrift, and the rest of the virtues recommended by the bourgeoisie are really his road to happiness? No one. He knows that he has something today, and that it does not depend upon himself whether he shall have something tomorrow. He knows that every breeze that blows, every whim of his employer, every bad turn of trade may hurl him back into the fierce whirlpool from which he has temporarily saved himself, and in which it is hard and often impossible to keep his head above water. He knows that, though he may have the means of living today, it is very uncertain whether he shall live tomorrow. Meanwhile, let us proceed to a more detailed investigation of the position in which the social war has placed the non-possessing class. Let us see what pay for his work society gives the working man in the form of dwelling, clothing, food, what sort of subsistence it grants those who contribute most to the maintenance of society. And first, let us consider the dwellings. Every great city has one or more slums, where the working class is crowded together. True, poverty often dwells in hidden alleys close to the palaces of the rich. But in general, a separate territory has been assigned to it where, removed from the sight of the happier classes, it may struggle along as it can. These slums are pretty equally arranged in all the great towns of England, the worst houses in the worst quarters of the towns. Usually 1 or 2 story cottages in long rows, perhaps with cellars used as dwellings, almost always irregularly built. These houses of 3 or 4 rooms and a kitchen form, throughout England, some parts of London excepted, the general dwellings of the working class. The streets are generally unpaved, rough, dirty, filled with vegetable and animal refuse, without sewers or gutters, but supplied with foul, stagnant pools instead. Moreover, ventilation is impeded by the bad, confused method of building of the whole quarter, and since many human beings here live crowded into a small space, the atmosphere that prevails in these working men's quarters may readily be imagined. Further, the streets serve as drying grounds in fine weather. Lines are stretched across from house to house and hung with wet clothing. Let us investigate some of the slums in their order. London comes first, and in London the famous rookery of St. Giles, which is now, at last, about to be penetrated by a couple of broad streets. St. Giles is in the midst of the most populous part of the town, surrounded by broad, splendid avenues in which the gay world of London idles about, in the immediate neighbourhood of Oxford Street, Regent Street, of Trafalgar Square, and the Strand. It is a disorderly collection of tall, 3 or 4-storied houses, with narrow, crooked, filthy streets in which there is quite as much life as in the great thoroughfares of the town, except that here people of the working class only are to be seen. A vegetable market is held in the street. Baskets with vegetables and fruits, naturally all bad and hardly fit to use, obstruct the sidewalk still further, and from these, as well as from the fish dealers' stalls, arises a horrible smell. The houses are occupied from cellar to garret, filthy within and without, and their appearance is such that no human being could possibly wish to live in them. But all this is nothing in comparison with the dwellings in the narrow courts and alleys between the streets, entered by crowded, covered passages between the houses in which the filth and tottering ruin surpass all description. Scarcely a whole window pane can be found, the walls are crumbling, doorposts and window frames loose and broken, doors of old boards nailed together, or altogether wanting in this thieves' quarter, where no doors are needed, there being nothing to steal. Heaps of garbage and ashes lie in all directions, and the foul liquids emptied before the doors gather in stinking pools. Here live the poorest of the poor, the worst paid workers with thieves and victims of prostitution indiscriminately huddled together, the majority Irish or of Irish extraction, and those who have not yet sunk in the whirlpool of moral ruin which surrounds them, sinking daily deeper, losing daily more and more of their power to resist the demoralizing influence of want, filth, and evil surroundings. Nor is St. Giles the only London slum. In the immense tangle of streets there are hundreds and thousands of alleys and courts, lined with houses too bad for anyone to live in, who can still spend anything whatsoever upon a dwelling fit for human beings. Close to the splendid houses of the rich, such a lurking place of the bitterest poverty may often be found. So, a short time ago, on the occasion of a coroner's inquest, a region close to Portman Square, one of the very respectable squares, was characterized as an abode of a multitude of Irish demoralized by poverty and filth. So too may be found in streets such as Long Acre and others, which, though not fashionable, are yet respectable, a great number of cellar dwellings out of which puny children and half-starved ragged women emerge into the light of day. In the immediate neighbourhood of Drury Lane Theatre, the second in London, are some of the worst streets of the whole metropolis, Charles, King and Park Streets, in which the houses are inhabited from cellar to garret exclusively by poor families. In the parishes of St. John and St. Margaret there lived in 1840, according to the Journal of the Statistical Society, 5,366 working men's families in 5,294 dwellings, if they deserve the name, men, women and children thrown together without distinction of age or sex, 26,830 persons all told, and of these families 3/4 possessed but one room. In the aristocratic parish of St. George, Hanover Square, there lived, according to the same authority, 1,465 working men's families, nearly 6,000 persons, under similar conditions, and here too, more than 2/3 of the whole number crowded together at the rate of one family in one room. But how the poverty of these unfortunates, among whom even thieves find nothing to steal, is exploited by the property-holding class in lawful ways. The abominable dwellings in Drury Lane, just mentioned, bring in the following rents. 2 cellar dwellings, 3 shillings. 1 room ground floor, 4 shillings. Ground story, 4 shillings 6pence. 3rd floor, 4 shillings. Garret room, 3 shillings weekly, so that the starving occupants of Charles Street alone pay the house owners a yearly tribute of £2,000, and the 5,366 families above mentioned in Westminster a yearly rent of £40,000. The most extensive working people's district lies in the east of the Tower in Whitechapel and Bethnal Green, where the greatest masses of London working people live. Let us hear Mr. G. Alston, preacher of St. Philip's of Bethnal Green, on the condition of his parish. He says, it contains 1,400 houses inhabited by 2,795 families, or about 12,000 persons. The space upon which this large population dwells is less than 400 yards, 1,200 feet square, and in this overcrowding it is nothing unusual to find a man, his wife, 4 or 5 children, and sometimes both grandparents, all in one single room of 10 to 12 square feet, where they eat, sleep, and work. I believe that before the Bishop of London called attention to this most poverty-stricken parish, people of the West End knew as little of it as the savages, his words, of Australia or the South Sea Isles. And if we make ourselves acquainted with those unfortunates, through personal observation, if we watch them at their scanty meal and see them bowed by illness and want of work, we shall find a mass of helplessness and misery that a nation like ours must blush that these things can be possible. I was rector near Huddersfield during the 3 years in which the mills were at their worst, but I have never seen such complete helplessness of the poor as since then in Bethnal Green. Not one father of a family in 10 in the whole neighbourhood has other clothing than his working suit, and that is as bad and tattered as possible. Many, indeed, have no other covering for the night than these rags, and no bed save a sack of straw and shavings. The foregoing description furnishes an idea of the aspect of the interior of the dwellings. But let us follow the English officials who occasionally strayed thither into one or two of these working men's homes.
On the occasion of an inquest held on the 14th of November 1843 by Mr. Carter, coroner for Surrey, upon the body of Anne Galway, aged 45 years, the newspapers related the following particulars concerning the deceased. She had lived at number 3 White Lion Court, Bermondsey Street, London, with her husband and a 19-year-old son in a little room, in which neither a bedstead nor any other furniture was to be seen. She lay dead beside her son upon a heap of feathers which were scattered over her almost naked body, there being neither sheet nor coverlet. The feathers stuck so fast over the whole body that the physician could not examine the corpse until it was cleansed, and then found it starved and scarred from the bites of vermin. Part of the floor of the room was torn up, and the whole used by the family as a privy. On Monday, 15th of January 1844, 2 boys were brought before the police magistrate because, being in starving condition, they had stolen and immediately devoured a half-cooked calf's foot from a shop. The magistrate felt called upon to investigate the case further, and received the following details from the policeman. The mother of the 2 boys was the widow of an ex-soldier, afterwards policeman, and had had a very hard time since the death of her husband to provide for her 9 children. She lived at number 2 Pools Place, Quaker Court, Spitalfields, in the utmost poverty. When the policeman came to her, he found her with 6 of her children literally huddled together in a little back room, with no furniture but 2 rush-bottomed chairs, with the seats gone, a small table with 2 legs broken, a broken cup, and a small dish. On the hearth was scarcely a spark of fire, and in one corner lay as many old rags as would fill a woman's apron, which served the whole family as a bed. For bed clothing, they had only their scanty day clothing. The poor woman told him that she had been forced to sell her bedstead the year before to buy food. Her bedding she had pawned with the victualler for food. In short, everything had gone for food. The magistrate ordered the woman a considerable provision from the poor box. In February 1844, Teresa Bishop, a widow of 60 years old, was recommended with her sick daughter, aged 26, to the commission of the police magistrate at Marlborough Street. She lived at number 5 Brown Street, Grosvenor Square, in a small back room no larger than a closet, in which there was not one single piece of furniture. In one corner lay some rags upon which both slept. A chest served as table and chair. The mother earned a little by charring. The owner of the house said that they had lived in this way since May 1843, had gradually sold or pawned everything that they had, and had still never paid any rent. The magistrate assigned them £1 from the poor box. I am far from asserting that all London working people live in such want as the foregoing 3 families. I know very well that 10 are somewhat better off, where one is so totally trodden underfoot by society. But I assert that thousands of industrious and worthy people, far worthier and more to be respected than all the rich of London, do find themselves in a condition unworthy of human beings, and that every proletarian, every one without exception, is exposed to a similar fate without any fault of his own, and in spite of every possible effort. But in spite of all this, they who have some kind of a shelter are fortunate in comparison with the utterly homeless. In London, 50,000 human beings get up every morning not knowing where they are going to lay their heads at night. The luckiest of this multitude, those who succeed in keeping a penny or 2 until evening, enter a lodging house such as abound in every great city, where they find a bed. But what a bed! These houses are filled with beds from cellar to garret, 4, 5, 6 beds in a room, as many as can be crowded. Into every bed 4, 5, or 6 human beings are piled, as many as can be packed in, sick and well, young and old, drunk and sober, men and women, just as they come indiscriminately. Then come strife, blows, wounds, or if these bedfellows agree, so much the worse. Thefts are arranged and things done which our language, grown more humane than our deeds, refuses to record. And those who cannot pay for such a refuge? They sleep where they find a place, in passages, arcades, in corners where the police and the owners leave them undisturbed. A few individuals find their way to the refuges which are managed here and there by private charity. Others sleep on the benches in the parks close under the windows of Queen Victoria. Let us hear the London Times. It appears from the report of the proceedings of Marlborough Street, police court in our columns yesterday, that there is an average number of 50 human beings of all ages who huddle together in the parks every night, having no other shelter than what is supplied by the trees and a few hollows of the embankment. Of these, the majority are young girls who have been seduced from the country by the soldiers and turned loose on the world in all the destitution of friendless penury, and all the recklessness of early vice. This is truly horrible. Poor there must be everywhere. Indigence will find its way and it set up its hideous state in the heart of a great and luxurious city. Amid the thousand narrow lanes and by-streets of a populous metropolis there must always be fear. As we fear, be much suffering. Much that offends the eye, much that lurks unseen. But that within the precincts of wealth, gaiety, and fashion, nigh the regal grandeur of St. James, close on the palatial splendour of Bayswater, on the confines of the old and new aristocratic quarters, in a district where the cautious refinement of modern design has refrained from creating one single tenement for poverty, which seems, as it were, dedicated to the exclusive enjoyment of wealth, that there want and famine and disease and vice should stalk in all their kindred horrors, consuming body by body, soul by soul. It is indeed a monstrous state of things. Enjoyment, the most absolute, that bodily ease, intellectual excitement, or the more innocent pleasures of sense can supply to man's craving, brought in close contact with the most unmitigated misery. Wealth, from its bright saloons, laughing, an instantly heedless laugh, at the unknown wounds of want. Pleasure, cruelly but unconsciously mocking the pain that moans below. All contrary things, mocking one another. All contrary, save the vice which tempts and the vice which is tempted. But let all men remember this, that within the most courtly precincts of the richest city on God's earth, there may be found, night after night, winter after winter, women, young in years, old in sin and suffering, outcast from society, rotting from famine, filth, and disease. Let them remember this and learn not to theorize but to act. God knows there is much room for action nowadays. I've referred to the refuges for the homeless. How greatly overcrowded these are, two examples may show. A newly elected refuge for the houseless in Upper Ogle Street, that can shelter 300 persons every night, has received since its opening, 27 January to 17 March 1844, 2,740 persons for one or more nights, and although the season was growing more favourable, the number of applicants in this, as well as in the asylums of Whitecross Street and Wapping, was strongly on the increase, and a crowd of the homeless had to be sent away every night for want of room. In another refuge, the Central Asylum in Playhouse Yard, there were supplied on an average 460 beds nightly during the first 3 months of the year, 1844, 6,681 persons being sheltered, and 96,141 portions of bread were distributed. Yet the Committee of Directors declared this institution began to meet the pressure of the needy to a limited extent only when the Eastern Asylum also was opened. Let us leave London and examine the other great cities of the free kingdoms in their order. Let us take Dublin first, a city the approach to which from the sea is as charming as that of London is imposing. The Bay of Dublin is the most beautiful in all the British Isles. It is even compared by the Irish with the Bay of Naples. The city, too, possesses great attractions, and its aristocratic districts are better and more tastefully laid out than those of any other British city. By way of compensation, however, the poorer districts of Dublin are among the most hideous and repulsive to be seen in the world. True, the Irish character, which under some circumstances is comfortable only in the dirt, has some share in this, but as we find thousands of Irish in every great city in England and Scotland, and as every poor population must gradually sink into the same uncleanliness, the wretchedness of Dublin is nothing specific, nothing peculiar to Dublin, but something common to all great towns. The poor quarters of Dublin are extremely extensive, and the filth, the uninhabitableness of the houses, and the neglect of the streets surpass all description. Some idea of the manner in which the poor are here crowded together may be from the fact that, in 1817, according to the report of the Inspector of Workhouses, 1,318 persons lived in 52 houses with 390 rooms in Barrow Street, and 1,997 persons in 71 houses with 393 rooms in and near Church Street. That in this and the adjoining district there exists a multitude of foul courts and alleys, many cellars receive all their light through the door, while in not a few the inhabitants sleep upon the bare floor, though most of them possess bedsteads at least. Nicholson's Court, for example, contains 28 wretched little rooms, with 151 human beings in the greatest want, there being but 2 bedsteads and 2 blankets to be found in the whole court. The poverty is so great in Dublin that a single benevolent institution, the Mendicity Association, gives relief to 2,500 persons or 1% of the population, daily, receiving and feeding them for the day and dismissing them at night. Dr. Allison describes a similar state of things in Edinburgh, whose superb situation, which has won it the title of the modern Athens, and whose brilliant aristocratic quarter in the new town contrasts strongly with the foul wretchedness of the poor in the old town. Allison asserts that this extensive quarter is as filthy and horrible as the worst district of Dublin, where the Mendicity Association would have as great a proportion of needy persons to assist in Edinburgh as in the Irish capital. He asserts indeed that the poor in Scotland, especially in Edinburgh and Glasgow, are worse off than in any other region of the Three Kingdoms, and that the poorest are not Irish but Scotch. The preacher of the Old Church of Edinburgh, Dr. Lee, testified in 1836 before the Commission of Religious Instruction that he had never before seen such misery as in his parish, where the people were without furniture, without everything, two married couples often sharing one room. In a single day he had visited 7 houses in which there was not a bed, in some of them not even a heap of straw. Old people of 80 years sleep on the board floor, nearly all slept in their day clothes. In one cellar room he found 2 families from a Scotch country district. Soon after their removal to the city, 2 of the children had died, and the third was dying at the time of his visit. Each family had a filthy pile of straw lying in a corner. The cellar sheltered besides the 2 families a donkey, and was moreover so dark that it was impossible to distinguish one person from another by day. Dr. Lee declared that it was enough to make a heart of adamant bleed to see such misery in a country like Scotland. In the Edinburgh Medical and Surgical Journal, Dr. Hennon reports a similar state of things. From a parliamentary report, it is evident that in the dwellings of the poor of Edinburgh a want of cleanliness reigns, and such as must be expected under these conditions. On the bedposts, chickens roost at night, dogs and horses share the dwellings of human beings, and the natural consequence is a shocking stench, with filth and swarms of vermin. The prevailing construction of Edinburgh favours these atrocious conditions as far as possible. The old town is built upon both slopes of a ridge, along the crest of which runs the High Street. Out of the High Street, there open downwards multitudes of narrow, crooked alleys, called wynds from their many turnings, and these wynds form the proletarian district of the city. The houses of the Scotch cities, in general, are 5 or 6-storied buildings, like those of Paris, and in contrast with England there, where, so far as possible, each family has a separate house. The crowding of human beings upon a limited area is thus intensified. These streets, says an English journal, in an article upon the sanitary conditions of the working people in cities, are often so narrow that a person can step from the window of one house into that of an opposite neighbour, while the houses are piled so high, story upon story, that the light can scarcely penetrate into the quarter alley that lies between. In this part of the city there are neither sewers nor other drains, nor even privies belonging to the houses. In consequence, all refuse, garbage, and excrements of at least 50,000 persons are thrown into the gutters every night, so that, in spite of all street sweeping, a mass of dried filth and foul vapours are created, which not only offend the sight and smell, but endanger the health of the inhabitants to the highest degree. Is it to be wondered that in such localities all considerations of health, morals, and even the most ordinary decency are utterly neglected? On the contrary, all who are more intimately acquainted with the condition of the inhabitants will testify to the high degree which disease, wretchedness, and demoralization have here reached. Society in such districts has sunk to a level indescribably low and hopeless. The houses of the poor are generally filthy, and are evidently never cleansed. They consist in most cases of a single room, which, while subject to the worst ventilation, is yet usually kept cold by the broken and badly fitted windows, and is sometimes damp and partly below ground level. Always badly furnished and thoroughly uncomfortable, a straw heap often serving the whole family for a bed, upon which men and women, young and old, sleep in revolting confusion. Water can be had only from the public pumps, and the difficulty of obtaining it naturally fosters all possible filth. Right, I'm going to be back in a moment, so I just need to make a call of nature. Okay, I've just been informed that I've hit my target. So thanks everyone for your donations, but keep on doing what you can. And yeah, if you still want to keep stay on and just contribute what you can, that'd be great. But anyway, right. Sorry, just needed that. I'm going to continue now. In the other great seaport towns, the scene is no better. Liverpool, with all its commerce, wealth, and grandeur, yet treats its workers with the same barbarity. A full fifth of the population, more than 45,000 human beings, live in narrow, dark, damp, badly ventilated cellar dwellings, of which there are 7,862 in the city. Besides these cellar dwellings, there are 2,270 courts, small spaces built up on all four sides, and having but one entrance, a narrow covered passageway, the whole ordinarily very dirty and inhabited exclusively by the proletarians. Of such courts we shall have more to say when we come to Manchester. In Bristol, on one occasion, 2,800 families were visited, of whom 46% occupied but one room each. Precisely the same state of things prevails in the factory towns. In Nottingham, there are in all 11,000 houses, of which 7,000 and 8,000 are built back-to-back with a rear party wall so that no through ventilation is possible, while a single privy usually serves for several houses. During an investigation made a short time since, many rows of houses were found to have been built over shallow drains covered only by the boards of the ground floor. In Leicester, Derby, and Sheffield, it is no better. Of Birmingham, the article above cited from the Artisan states, in the older quarters of the city, there are many bad districts, filthy and neglected, full of stagnant pools and heaps of refuse. Courts are very numerous in Birmingham, reaching 2,000 and containing the greater number of the working people of the city. These courts are usually narrow, muddy, badly ventilated, ill-drained, and lined with 8 to 20 houses, which, by reason of having their rear walls in common, can usually be ventilated from one side only. In the background, within the court, there is usually an ash heap or something of the kind, the filth of which cannot be described. It must, however, be observed that the newer courts are more sensibly built and more decently kept, and that even in the old ones the cottages are much less crowded than in Manchester and Liverpool. Wherefore Birmingham shows, even during the reign of an epidemic, a far smaller mortality than, for instance, Wolverhampton, Dudley, and Bilston, were only a few miles distant. Cellar dwellings are unknown too in Birmingham, though a few cellars are misused as workrooms. The lodging houses for proletarians are rather numerous, over 400, chiefly in courts at the heart of the town. They are nearly all disgustingly filthy and ill-smelling, the refuge of beggars, thieves, tramps, and prostitutes, who eat, drink, smoke, and sleep here without the slightest regard to comfort or decency in an atmosphere endurable to these degraded beings only. Glasgow is in many respects similar to Edinburgh, possessing the same winds, the same tall houses. Of the city, the Artisan observes, the working class forms here some 78% of the whole population, about 300,000, and lives in parts of the city which exceed in wretchedness and squalor the lowest nooks of St. Giles and Whitechapel, the liberties of Dublin, the wines of Edinburgh. There are numbers of such localities in the heart of the city, south of the Trongate, westward from the Salt Market, in Calton and off the High Street, endless labyrinths of lanes or wynds into which open, at almost every step, courts or blind alleys, formed by ill-ventilated, high-piled, waterless, and dilapidated houses. These are literally swarming with inhabitants. They contain 3 or 4 families upon each floor, perhaps 20 persons. In some cases, each story is let out in sleeping places, so that 15 to 20 persons are packed, one on top of the other, I cannot say accommodated, in a single room. These districts shelter the poorest, most depraved, and worthless members of society, of the community, and may be regarded as the sources of those frightful epidemics which, beginning here, spread desolation over Glasgow. Let us hear how J.C. Symonds, Government Commissioner for the Investigation of the Condition of the Hand Weavers, describes these portions of the city. I have seen wretchedness in some of its worst phases here, both here and upon the continent, but until I visited the wynds of Glasgow, I did not believe that so much crime, misery, and disease could exist in any civilized country. In the lower lodging houses, 10, 12, sometimes 20 persons of both sexes, all ages and various degrees of nakedness, sleep indiscriminately, huddled together upon the floor. These dwellings are usually so damp, filthy, and ruinous that no one could wish to keep his horse in one of them. And in another place, The wynds of Glasgow contain a fluctuating population of 15 to 30,000 human beings. This quarter consists wholly of narrow alleys and square courts, in the middle of every one of which there lies a dung heap. Revolting as was the outward appearance of these courts, I was yet not prepared for the filth and wretchedness within. In some of the sleeping places which we visited at night, the Superintendent of Police, Captain Miller, and Simons, we found a complete layer of human beings stretched upon the floor, often 15 to 20, some clad, others naked, men and women indiscriminately. Their bed was a litter of mouldy straw mixed with rags. There was little or no furniture, and the only thing which gave these dens any shimmer of habitableness was a fire upon the hearth. Theft and prostitution formed the chief means of subsistence of this population. No one seemed to take the trouble to cleanse this orgy stable, this pandemonium, this tangle of crime, filth, and pestilence in the center of the second city of the kingdom. An extended examination of the lowest districts of other cities never revealed anything half so bad, either in intensity of moral and physical infection or in comparative density of population. In this quarter, most of the houses have been declared by the Court of Guild ruinous and unfit for habitation, but precisely these are the most densely populated because, according to law, no rent can be demanded from them. The great manufacturing district in the centre of the British Isles, the thickly peopled stretch of West Yorkshire and South Lancashire, with its numerous factory towns, yields nothing to the other great manufacturing centres. The woolen district of the West Riding of Yorkshire is a charming region, a beautiful green hill country whose uplands grow more rugged towards the west until they reach their highest point in the bold ridge of Blackstone Edge, the watershed between the Irish Sea and the North Sea. The valleys of the Aire, among which stretches Leeds, and of the Calder, through which the Manchester-Leeds Railway runs, are among the most attractive in England, and are strewn in all directions with the factories, villages, and towns. The houses of rough grey stone look so neat and clean in comparison with the blackened brick buildings of Lancashire that it is a pleasure to look at them. But on coming into the towns themselves, one finds little to rejoice over. Leeds lies as the artisan describes it, and as I found confirmed upon examination, on a gentle slope that descends into the valley of the Aire. This stream flows through the city for about a mile and a half and is exposed to violent floods during thaws or heavy rain. The higher western portions of the city are clean for such a large town, but the low-lying districts along the river and its tributary becks are narrow, dirty, and enough in themselves to shorten the lives of the inhabitants, especially of little children. Added to this, the disgusting state of the working men's districts about Kirkgate, Marsh Lane, Cross Street, and Richmond Road, which is chiefly attributable to their unpaved, drainless streets, irregular architecture, numerous courts and alleys, and total lack of the most ordinary means of cleanliness. All this taken together is explanation enough of the excessive mortality in these unhappy abodes of filthy misery. In consequence of the overflows of the Aire, which, it must be added, like all other rivers in the service of manufacture, flows into the city at one end clear and transparent, and flows out of the other end thick, black, and foul, smelling of all possible refuse. The houses and cellars are often so full of water that they have to be pumped out, and at such times the water rises, even where there are sewers, out of them into cellars, engenders miasmatic vapors strongly impregnated with sulphuretted hydrogen, and leaves a disgusting residuum highly injurious to health. During the spring floods of 1839, the action of such a choking of the sewers was so injurious that, according to the report of the Registrar of Births and Deaths for this part of the town, there were 3 deaths to 2 births, whereas in the same 3 months, in every other part of the town, there were 3 births to 2 deaths. Other thickly populated districts are without any sewers whatsoever, or so badly provided as to derive no benefit from them. In some rows of houses, the cellars are seldom dry. In certain districts, there are several streets covered with soft mud a foot deep. The inhabitants have made vain attempts from time to time to repair these streets with shovelfuls of cinders, but in spite of all such attempts, dung heaps and pools of dirty water emptying from the houses fill all the holes until wind and sun dry them up. An ordinary cottage in Leeds occupies not more than 5 yards square of land, and usually consists of a cellar, a living room, and 1 sleeping room. These contracted dwellings, filled day and night with human beings, are another point dangerous alike to the morals and the health of the inhabitants. and how greatly these cottages are crowded, the report on the health of the working classes quoted above bears testimony. In Leeds, we find brothers and sisters and lodgers of both sexes sharing the parents' sleeping room, whence arise consequences at the contemplation of which human feeling shudders. So to Bradford, which but 7 miles from Leeds at the junction of several valleys, lies upon the banks of a small, coal-black, foul-smelling stream. On weekdays, the town is enveloped in a grey cloud of coal smoke, but on a fine Sunday it offers a superb picture, when viewed from the surrounding heights. Yet within reigns the same filth and discomfort as in Leeds. The older portions of the town are built upon steep hillsides and are narrow and irregular. In the lanes, alleys, and courts lie filth and debris in heaps. The houses are ruinous, dirty, and miserable, and in the immediate vicinity of the river and the valley bottom I found many a one whose ground floor, half buried in the hillside, was totally abandoned. In general, the portions of the valley bottom in which working men's cottages have crowded between the tall factories are among the worst built and dirtiest districts of the whole town. In the newer portions of this, as of every other factory town, the cottages are more regular, being built in rows, but they share here too all the evils incident to the customary method of providing working men's dwellings, evils of which we shall have occasions to speak more particularly in discussing Manchester. The same is true of the remaining towns of the West Riding, especially of Barnsley, Halifax, and Huddersfield. The last named, the handsomest by far of all the factory towns in Yorkshire and Lancashire, by reason of its charming situation and modern architecture, has yet its bad quarter. For a committee appointed by a meeting of citizens to survey the town reported on the 5th of August 1844. It is notorious that in Huddersfield whole streets and many lanes and courts are neither paved nor supplied with sewers nor other drains, but in them refuse, debris, and filth of every sort lies accumulating, festers and rots, and that nearly everywhere stagnant water accumulates in pools, in consequence of which the adjoining dwellings must inevitably be bad and filthy, so that in such places diseases arise and threaten the health of the whole town. If we cross Blackstone Edge by road or railway, we enter upon that classic soil on which English manufacture has achieved its masterwork and from which all labour movements emanate, namely South Lancashire with its central city, Manchester. Again, we have beautiful hill country, sloping gently from the watershed westwards towards the Irish Sea, with the charming green valleys of the Ribble, the Irwell, the Mersey, and their tributaries. A country which 100 years ago chiefly swampland, thinly populated, is now sown with towns and villages, and is the most densely populated strip of country in England. In Lancashire, and especially in Manchester, English manufacture finds at once its starting point and its centre. The Manchester Exchange is the thermometer for all the fluctuations of trade. The modern art of manufacture has reached its perfection in Manchester. In the cotton industry of South Lancashire, the application of the forces of nature, the superseding of hand labour by machinery, especially by the power loom and the self-acting mule, and the division of labour are seen at the highest point. And if we recognise in these three elements what is characteristic of modern manufacture, we must confess that the cotton industry has remained in advance of all other branches of industry from the beginning down to the present day. The effects of modern manufacture upon the working class must necessarily develop here most freely and perfectly, and the manufacturing proletariat present itself in its fullest classic perfection. The degradation to which the application of steam power, machinery, and the division of labour reduce the working man, and the attempts of the proletariat to rise above this abasement, must likewise be carried out to the highest point and with the fullest consciousness. Hence, because Manchester is the classic type of a modern manufacturing town, and because I know it as intimately as my own native town, more intimately than most of us residents know it, we shall make a longer stay here. The towns surrounding Manchester vary little from the central city, so far as the working people's quarters are concerned, except that the working class forms, if possible, a large proportion of their population. These towns are purely industrial and conduct all their business through Manchester, upon which they are in every respect dependent, whence they are inhabited only by working men and petty tradesmen, while Manchester has a very considerable commercial population, especially of commission and respectable retail dealers. Hence, Bolton, Preston, Wigan, Bury, Rochdale, Middleton, Haywood, Oldham, Ashton, Stalybridge, Stockport, etc., though nearly all towns of 30, 50, 70 to 90,000 inhabitants, are almost wholly working people's districts, interspersed only with factories, a few thoroughfares lined with shops, and a few lanes upon which the gardens and houses of the manufacturers are scattered like villas. The towns themselves are badly and irregularly built, with foul courts, lanes, and back alleys reeking of coal smoke and especially dingy from the originally bright red brick, turned black with time, which is here the universal building material. Cellar dwellings are general here. Wherever it is in any way possible, these subterranean dens are constructed, and a very considerable portion of the population dwells in them. Among the worst of these towns, after Preston and Oldham, is Bolton, 11 miles northwest of Manchester. It has, so far as I have been able to observe in my repeated visits, but one main street, a very dirty one, Deansgate, which serves as a market and is even in the finest weather a dark, unattractive hole in spite of the fact that, except for the factories, its sides are formed by low 1- and 2-storied houses. Here, as everywhere, the older part of the town is especially ruinous and miserable. A dark-coloured body of water, which leaves the beholder in doubt whether it is a brook or a long stretch of stagnant puddles, flows through the town and contributes its share to the total pollution of the air, by no means pure even without it. There is Stockport too, which lies on the Cheshire side of the Mersey, but belongs nevertheless to the manufacturing district of Manchester. It lies in a narrow valley along the Mersey, so that the streets slope down a steep hill on one side and up an equally steep hill on the other, while the railway from Manchester to Birmingham passes over a high viaduct above the city and the whole valley. Stockport is renowned throughout the entire district as one of the duskiest, smokiest holes, and looks, indeed, especially when viewed from the viaduct, excessively repellent. But far more repulsive are the cottages and cellar dwellings of the working class, which stretch in long rows through all parts of the town from the valley bottom to the crest of the hill. I do not remember to have seen so many cellars used as dwellings in any other town of this district. A few miles northeast of Stockport is Ashton-under-Lyne, one of the newest factory towns of this region. It stands on the slope of a hill at the foot of which are the canal and the River Tame, and is, in general, by this method, the factories would be excluded from the town proper, even if the proximity of the river and the canalway did not draw them all into the valley, where they stand thickly crowded, belching forth black smoke from their chimneys. To this arrangement, Ashton owes a much more attractive appearance than that of most factory towns. The streets are broad and cleaner, the cottages look new, bright red and comfortable. But the modern system of building cottages for working men has its own advantages. Every street has its concealed back lane to which a narrow paved path leads, and which is all the dirtier. And although I saw no buildings, except a few on entering, which could have been more than 50 years old, there are even in Ashton Street in which the cottages are getting bad, where the bricks in the house corners are no longer firm but shift about, where the walls have cracks and will not hold the chalk whitewash inside, streets whose dirty, smoke-begrimed aspect is no wise different from that of the other towns of the district, except that in Ashton this is the exception, not the rule. A mile eastward lies Stalybridge, also on the Tame. In coming over the hill from Ashton, the traveller has at the top, both right and left, fine large gardens with superb villa-like houses in their midst, built usually in the Elizabethan style, which is to the Gothic precisely what the Anglican Church is to the Apostolic Roman Catholic. 100 paces farther, and Stalybridge shows itself in the valley, in sharp contrast with the beautiful country seats, in sharp contrast even with the modest cottages of Ashton. Stalybridge lies in a narrow, crooked ravine, more narrower even than the valley at Stockport, and both sides of this ravine are occupied by an irregular group of cottages, houses, and mills. On entering, the very first cottages are narrow, smoke-begrimed, old and ruinous, and as the first houses are, so is the whole town. A few streets lie in the narrow valley bottom, most of them run criss-cross, pell-mell, uphill and down, and in nearly all the houses, by reason of this sloping situation, the ground floor is half buried in the hearth. And what multitudes of courts, back lanes, and remote nooks arise out of this confused way of building may be seen from the hills, whence one has the town here and there in a bird's-eye view almost at one's feet. Add to this the shocking filth and the repulsive effect of Stalybridge, in spite of its pretty surroundings, may be readily imagined. But enough of these little towns. Each has its own peculiarities, but in general, the working people live in them just as in Manchester. Hence, I have especially sketched only their particular construction, and would observe that all more general observations as to the condition of the labouring population in Manchester are fully applicable to these surrounding towns as well. Manchester lies at the foot of the southern slope of a range of hills, which stretch hither from Oldham, their last peak, Castlemore being at once the racecourse and the Mons Caesar of Manchester. Manchester proper lies on the left bank of the Irwell, between that stream and the two smaller ones, the Irk and the Medlock, which here empty into the Irwell. On the right bank of the Irwell, bounded by a sharp curve of the river, lies Salford, and farther westward Pendleton. Northward from the Irwell lie Upper and Lower Brofton. Northward of the Irk, Cheetham Hill. South of the Medlock lies Hume. Farther east, Chorlton on Medlock. Still farther, pretty well to the east of Manchester, Ardwick. The whole assemblage of buildings is commonly called Manchester, and contains about 400,000 inhabitants, rather more than less. The town itself is peculiarly built, so that a person may live in it for years and go in and out daily without coming into contact with a working people's quarter or even with workers. That is, so long as he confines himself to his business or to pleasure walks. This arises chiefly from the fact that, by unconscious tacit agreement as well as with outspoken unconscious determination, the working people's quarters are sharply separated from the sections of the city reserved to the middle class. Or, if this does not succeed, they are concealed with the cloak of charity. Manchester contains, at its heart, a rather extended commercial district, perhaps half a mile long and about as broad, and consisting almost wholly of offices and warehouses. Nearly the whole district is abandoned by dwellers and is lonely and deserted at night. Only watchmen and policemen traverse its narrow lanes with their dark lanterns. This district is cut through by certain main thoroughfares, upon which the vast traffic concentrates, and in which the ground level is lined with brilliant shops. In these streets, the upper floors are occupied here and there is a good deal of life upon them until late at night. With the exception of this commercial district, all Manchester proper, all Salford and Hume, a great part of Pendleton and Chorlton, 2/3 of Ardwick, and single stretches of Cheetham Hill and Broughton, are all unmixed working people's quarters, stretching like a girdle, averaging 1.5 miles in breadth around the commercial district. Outside, beyond this girdle, lives the upper and middle bourgeoisie. The middle bourgeoisie is regularly laid out streets in the vicinity of the working quarters, especially in Chorlton and the lower lying portions of Cheetham Hill. The upper bourgeoisie in remoter villas with gardens in Chorlton and Ardwick, or on the breezy heights of Cheetham Hill, Broughton and Pendleton in free, wholesome country air, in fine, comfortable houses, passed once every half or quarter hour by omnibuses going into the city. And the finest part of the arrangements is this, that the members of this money aristocracy can take the shortest road through the middle of all the labouring districts to their places of business, without ever seeing that they are in the midst of the grimy misery that lurks to the right and the left. For the thoroughfares leading from the exchange in all directions out of the city are lined on both sides with an almost unbroken series of shops, and are so kept in the hands of the middle and lower bourgeoisie, which out of self-interest cares for the decent and cleanly external appearance and can care for it. True, these shops bear some relation to the districts which lie behind them and are more elegant in the commercial and residential quarters than when they hide grimy working men's buildings. But they suffice to conceal from the eyes of the wealthy women and women of strong stomachs and weak nerves the misery and grime which form the complement to their wealth. So, for instance, Deansgate, which leads from the old church directly southward. Its line is lined first with mills and warehouses, then with second-rate shops and alehouses. Farther south, when it leaves the commercial district, with less inviting shops which grow dirtier and more interrupted by beer houses and gin palaces, the farther one goes, until at the southern end the appearance of the shops leaves no doubt that workers and workers only are their customers. So Market Street, running southeast from the exchange, at first brilliant shops of the best sort, with counting houses or warehouses above, in the continuation. Piccadilly, immense houses, hotels and warehouses. In the farther continuation, London Road. In the neighbourhood of the Medlock, factories, beerhouses, shops for the humbler bourgeoisie and the working population. And from this point onward, large gardens and villas of the wealthier merchants and manufacturers. In this way, anyone who knows Manchester can infer the adjoining districts from the appearance of the thoroughfare, but one is seldom in a position to catch from the street a glimpse of the real labouring districts. I know very well that this hypocritical plan is more or less common to all great cities. I know, too, that the retail dealers are forced by the nature of their businesses to take possession of the great highways. I know that there are more good buildings than bad ones upon such streets everywhere, and that the value of land is greater near them than in remoter districts. But at the same time, I have never seen so systematic a shutting out of the working class from the thoroughfares, so tender a concealment of everything which might affront the eye and the nerves of the bourgeoisie as in Manchester. And yet, in other respects, Manchester is more growth of accident than any other city. And when I consider in this connection the eager assurances of the middle class that the working class is doing famously, I cannot help feeling that the liberal manufacturers, the bigwigs of Manchester, are not so innocent after all in the manner of this sensitive method of construction. I may mention just here that the mills following the rivers or the different canals that ramify throughout the city before I proceed at once to describe the old labouring quarters. First of all, there is the old town of Manchester, which lies between the northern boundary of the commercial district and the Irk. Here the streets, even the better ones, are narrow and winding like Todd Street, Long Millgate, Willie Grove and Shude Hill. The houses dirty, old and tumble down, and the construction of the side streets utterly horrible. Going from the old church to Long Millgate, the stroller has at once a row of old-fashioned houses on the right, of which not one has kept its original level. These are remnants of the old pre-manufacturing Manchester, whose former inhabitants have removed, with their descendants, into better-built districts, and have left the houses, which were not good enough for them, to a working-class population strongly mixed with Irish blood. Here, one is in an almost undisguised working men's quarter, for even the shops and beer houses hardly take the trouble to exhibit a trifling degree of cleanliness. But all this is nothing in comparison with the courts and lanes which lie behind, to which access can be gained only through covered passages in which no two human beings can pass at the same time. Of the irregular cramming together of dwellings in ways which defy all rational plan, of the tangle in which they are crowded literally one upon the other, it is also impossible to convey an idea. And it is not the buildings surviving from the old times of Manchester which are to blame for this. The confusion has only recently reached its height when every scrap of space left by the old way of building has been filled up and patched over until not a foot of land is left to be further occupied. To confirm my statement, I have drawn here a small section of the plan of Manchester, not the worst spot and not 1/10 of the whole down. This drawing will suffice to characterise the irrational manner in which the entire district was built, particularly the part near the Irk. The south bank of the Irk is here very steep and between 50 and 30 feet high. On this abrupt slope there are planted 3 rows of houses, of which the lowest rise directly out of the river, while the front walls of the highest stand on the crest of the rise in Long Millgate. Among them are mills on the river. In short, the method of construction is as crowded and disorderly here as in the lower part of Long Millgate. Right and left, a multitude of covered passages lead from the main street into numerous courts, and he who turns in thither gets into filth and disgusting grime, the equal of which is not to be found, especially in the courts which lead down to the Irk and which contain unqualifiedly the most horrible dwellings which I have yet beheld. In one of these courts there stands directly at the entrance, at the end of the covered passage, a privy without a door, so dirty that the inhabitants can pass into and out of the court only by passing through foul pools of stagnant urine and excrement. This is the first court on the Irk above Ducie Bridge, in case anyone should care to look into it. Below it on the river there are several tanneries which fill the whole neighbourhood with the stench of animal putrefaction. Below Ducie Bridge the only entrance to most of the houses is by means of narrow, dirty stairs and over heaps of refuse and filth. The first court below Ducie Bridge, known as Allen's Court, was in such a state at the time of the cholera that the sanitary police ordered it evacuated, swept and disinfected with chloride of lime. Dr. Kay gives a terrible description of the state of this court at the time. Since then, it seems to have been partially torn down and rebuilt. At least looking down from Ducie Bridge, the passerby sees several ruined walls and heaps of debris with some newer houses. The view from this bridge at the bottom flows, or rather stagnates, the Irk, a narrow, coal-black, foul-smelling stream full of debris and refuse, which it deposits on the lower right bank. In dry weather, a long string of the most disgusting blackish-green slime pools are left standing on this bank, from the depths of which bubbles of miasmatic gas constantly arise and give forth a stench unendurable even on the bridge 40 or 50 feet above the surface, checked every few paces by high weirs, behind which slime and refuse accumulate and rot in thick masses. Above the bridge are tanneries, bone mills and gasworks, from which all drains and refuse find their way into the Irk, which receives further the contents of all the neighbouring sewers and privies. It may be easily imagined, therefore, what sort of residue the stream deposits. Below the bridge, you look upon the piles of debris, the refuse, filth, and offal from the courts on the steep left bank. Here, each house is barrack-like factory window buildings. On the lower right bank stands a long row of houses and mills, the second row being a ruin without a roof, piled with debris. The third stands so low that the lowest floor is uninhabitable, and therefore without windows or doors. Here the background embraces the pauper burial ground, the station of the Liverpool and Leeds Railway, and in the rear of this the workhouse, the Poor Law Bastille of Manchester, which, like a citadel, looks threateningly down from behind its high walls and parapets on the hilltop, upon the working people's quarter below. Above Ducie Bridge, the left bank grows more flat and the right bank steeper, but the condition of the dwellings on both banks grows worse rather than better. Whoever turns to the left here from the main street, Long Millgate, is lost. He wanders from one court to another, turns countless corners, passes nothing but narrow, filthy nooks and alleys, until after a few minutes he has lost all clue and knows not whither to turn. Everywhere half or wholly ruined buildings, some of them actually uninhabited, which means a great deal here. Rarely a wooden or stone floor to be seen in the houses, almost uniformly broken, ill-fitting windows and doors, and a state of filth. Everywhere heaps of debris, refuse and offal, standing pools for gutters, and a stench which alone would make it in lanes, laying others completely open to view. Immediately under the railway bridge there stands a court, the filth and horrors of which surpass all the others by far, just because it was hitherto so shut off, so secluded from that the way to it could not be found without a good deal of trouble. I should never have discovered it myself without the breaks made by the railway, though I thought I knew this whole region thoroughly. Passing through a rough bank, among stakes and washing lines, one penetrates into this chaos of small one-storied, one-roomed hovels, in most of which there is no artificial floor, kitchen, living and sleeping room all in one. In such a hole, carried scarcely 5 feet long by 6 broad, I found 2 beds, and such bedsteads and beds, which, with a staircase and a chimney place, entirely filled the room. In several others I found absolutely nothing, while the door stared open, and the inhabitants leaned against it. Everywhere before the doors refuse and offal, that any sort of pavement lay underneath could not be seen but only felt, here and there with the feet. This whole collection of cattle sheds for human beings was surmounted on 2 sides by houses and a factory, and on the third by the river, and besides a narrow stair up the bank, a narrow doorway alone led out into another almost equally ill-built, ill-kept labyrinth of dwellings. Enough! The whole side of the Irk is built in this way, a planless, knotted chaos of houses, more or less on the verge of uninhabitableness, whose unclean interiors fully correspond with their filthy external surroundings. And how could the people be clean with no proper opportunity for satisfying the most natural and ordinary wants? Privies are so rare here that they are either filled up every day or are too remote for most of the inhabitants to use. How can people wash when they have only the dirty Irk water at hand, while pumps and water pipes can be found in decent parts of the city alone? In truth, it cannot be charged to the account of these helots of modern society if their dwellings are not more clean than the pigsties which are here and there to be seen among them. The landlords are not ashamed to let dwellings like the 6 or 7 cellars on the quay directly below Scotland Bridge, the floors of which stand at least 2 feet below the low water level of the Irk that flows not 6 feet away from them, or like the upper floor of the corner house on the opposite shore directly above the bridge, where the ground floor, utterly inhabitable, stands deprived of all fittings for doors and windows, a case by no means rare in this region, when an open ground floor is used as a privy by the whole neighbourhood for want of other facilities. If we leave the Irk and penetrate once more on the opposite side from Long Millgate into the midst of the working men's dwellings, we shall come into buildings. We find at least long straight lanes and alley courts, built according to a plan and usually square. But if, in the former case, every house was built according to caprice, here each lane and court is so built without reference to the situation of the adjoining ones. The lanes run now in this direction, now in that, while every 2 minutes the wanderer goes into a blind alley, or, on turning a corner, finds himself back where he started from. Certainly no one who has not lived a considerable time in this labyrinth can find his way through it. If I may use the word at all in speaking of this district, the ventilation of these streets and courts is, in consequence of this confusion, quite as imperfect as in the Irk region. And if this quarter may, nevertheless, be said to have some advantage over that of the Irk, The houses being newer and the streets occasionally having gutters, nearly every house has, on the other hand, a cellar dwelling, which is rarely found in the Irk district, by reason of the greater age and more careless construction of the houses. As for the rest, the filth, debris, and offal heaps, and the pools in the streets are common to both quarters, and in the district now under discussion, another feature most injurious to the cleanliness of the inhabitants is the multitude of pigs walking about in all the alleys, rooting in the offal heaps, or kept imprisoned in small pens. Here, as in most of the working men's quarters of Manchester, the pork raisers rent the courts and build pig pens in them. In almost every court, one or even several such pens may be found, where the inhabitants of the court throw all refuse and offal, on which the swine grow fat, and the atmosphere, confined on all four sides, is utterly corrupted by putrefying animal and vegetable substances. Through this quarter, a broad and measurably decent street has been cut, Miller Street, and the background has been pretty successfully concealed. But if anyone should be led by curiosity to pass through one of the numerous passages which lead into the courts, he will find a piggery repeated at every 20 paces. Such is the old town of Manchester, and on rereading my description, I am forced to admit that instead of being exaggerated, it is far from black enough to convey a true impression of the filth, ruin, and uninhabitableness, the defiance of all considerations of cleanliness, ventilation, and health which characterize the construction of this single district, containing at least 20 to 30,000 inhabitants. And such a district exists in the heart of the second city of England, the first manufacturing city of the world. If anyone wishes to see in how little space a human being can move, how little air, and such air, he can breathe, how little of civilization he may share and yet live, it is only necessary to travel hither. True, this is the old town, and the people of Manchester emphasize the fact whenever anyone mentions to them the frightful condition of this hell upon earth. But what does that prove? Everything which here arouses horror and indignation is of recent origin, belongs to the industrial epoch. The couple of 100 houses which belong to Old Manchester have been long since abandoned by their original inhabitants. The industrial epoch alone has crammed into them the swarms of workers whom they now shelter. The industrial epoch alone has built up every spot between these old houses to make a covering for the masses, whom it has conjured hither from the agricultural districts and from Ireland. The industrial epoch alone enables the owners of these cattle sheds to rent them for high prices to human beings, to plunder the poverty of the workers, to undermine the health of thousands, in order that the owners may grow rich, that he must let himself be crowded into a dwelling too bad for every other, which he for his hard-earned wages buys the right to let go utterly to ruin. This is what's achieved. And without these workers and their poverty, this slavery would have been impossible. True, the original construction building. On the contrary, wherever a nook or corner was free, a house has been run up. Where a superfluous passage remained, it has been built on. The value of land rose with the blossoming out of manufacture, and the more it rose, the more madly was the work of building carried on, without reference to the health ticket who can pay for nothing better. However, it is the old town, and with this reflection the bourgeoisie is comforted. Let us see, therefore, how much better it is in the new town. The new town, known also as Irish Town, houses or groups of streets stand, here and there, like little villages on the naked, not even grass-grown clay soil. The houses, or rather cottages, are in bad order, never repaired, filthy, with damp, unclean, cellar dwellings. The lanes are neither paved nor supplied with sewers, but harbour numerous colonies of swine penned in small sties or yards, or wandering unrestrained through the neighbourhood. The mud in the streets is so deep that there is never a chance, except in the driest weather, of walking without sinking into it ankle-deep at every step. In the vicinity of St. George's Road, the separate groups of buildings approach each other more closely, ending in a continuation of lanes, blind alleys, back lanes, and courts, which grow more and more crowded and irregular the nearer they approach the heart of the town. True, they are here oftener paved or supplied with paved sidewalks and gutters, but the filth, the bad order of the houses, and especially of the cellars, remain the same. It may not be out of place to make some general observations here as to the customary construction of working men's quarters in Manchester. We have seen how in the old town pure accident determines the grouping of the houses in general. Every house is built without reference to any other, and the scraps of space between them are called courts for want of another name. In the somewhat newer portions of the same quarter, and in other men's quarters, dating from the early days of industrial activity, a somewhat more orderly arrangement may be found. The space between two streets is divided into more regular, usually square courts. These courts were built in this way from the beginning, and communicate with the streets by means of covered passages. If the totally planless construction is injurious to the health of the workers by preventing ventilation, this method of shutting them up in courts surrounded on all sides by buildings is far more so. The air simply cannot escape. The chimneys of the houses are the sole drains for the imprisoned atmosphere of the courts, and they serve the purpose only so long as fire is kept burning. Moreover, the houses surrounding such courts are usually built back to back, having the rear wall in common, and this alone suffices to present any sufficient for ventilation. And as the police charged with care of the streets does not trouble itself about the circulation of these courts, as everything quietly lies where it is thrown, there is no cause for wonder at the filth and heaps of ashes and offal to be found here. I have been in courts in Miller Street at least half a foot below the level of the thoroughfare, and without the slightest drainage for the water that accumulates in them in rainy weather. More recently, another different method of building was adopted, and this has now become general. Working men's cottages are almost never built singly, but always by the dozen or score, a single contractor building up one or two streets at a time. These are then arranged as follows. One front is formed of cottages of the Barrow Alley, the back street built up at both ends, into which either a narrow roadway or a covered passage leads from one side. The cottages which face this back street command least rent and are most neglected. These have their rear walls in common with the third row of houses which face a second street and command less rent than the first row and more than the second. The streets are laid out somewhat in the following manner. There's a diagram. By this method of construction, comparatively good ventilation can be obtained for the first row of cottages, and the third row is no worse off than with the former method. The middle row, on the other hand, is at least as badly ventilated as the houses in the courts, and the back street is always in the same filthy, disgusting condition as they. The contractors prefer this method because it saves them space and furnishes the means of fleecing better paid workers through the higher rents of the cottages in the first and third rows. These three different forms of cottage building are found all over Manchester and throughout Lancashire and Yorkshire, often mixed up together, but usually separate enough to indicate the relative age of parts of towns. The third system, that of the back alleys, prevails largely in the great working men's district east of St George's Road and Ancoats Street, and is the one most often found in the other working men's quarters of Manchester and its suburbs. In the last mentioned broad district, included under the name Ancoats, stand the largest mills of Manchester, lie in the canals, colossal 6- and 7-story buildings towering with their slender chimneys far above the low cottages of the workers. The population of the district consists, therefore, chiefly of mill hands, and in the worst streets of hand weavers. The streets nearest the heart of the town are the oldest and consequently the worst. They are, however, paved and supplied with drains. Among them I include those nearest to and parallel with Oldham Road and the Great Ancoats Street. Farther to the northeast lie many newly built up streets. Here the cottages look neat and cleanly, doors and windows are new and freshly painted, the rooms within newly whitewashed, the streets themselves are better aired, the vacant building lots between them larger and more numerous. But this can be said of a minority of the houses only. While cellar dwellings are to be found under almost every cottage, many streets are unpaved and without sewers. And, worse than all, this neat appearance is all pretense, a pretense which vanishes within the first 10 years. For the construction of the cottages individually is no less to be condemned than the plan of the streets. All such cottages look neat and substantial at first. Their impressive brick walls deceive the eye, and on passing through a liberal manufacturers, that the working population is nowhere so well housed as in England. But on closer examination, it becomes evident that the walls of these cottages are as thin as it is possible to make them. The outer walls, those of the cellar, which bear the weight of the ground floor and roof, are one whole brick thick at most, and the bricks lying with their long sides touching. but I have seen many a cottage of the same height, some in process of building, whose outer walls were but 1/2 brick thick, the bricks lying not sideways but lengthwise, their narrow ends touching. The object of this is to spare material, but there is also another reason for it. Namely, the fact that the contractors never own the land but lease it, according to the English custom, for 20, 30, 40, 50, or 99 years, at the expiration of which time it falls, with everything upon it, back into the possession of the original holder, who pays nothing in return for improvements upon it. The improvements are therefore so calculated by the leasee as to be worth as little as possible at the expiration of the stipulated term. And as such cottages are often built but 20 or 30 years before the expiration of the term, it may easily be imagined that the contractors make no unnecessary expenditure upon them. Moreover, these contractors, usually carpenters and builders or manufacturers, spend little or nothing in repairs, partly to avoid diminishing their rent receipts, and partly in view of the approaching surrender of the improvement to the landowner. While in consequence of commercial crises and the loss of work that follows them, whole streets often stand empty, the cottages falling rapidly into ruin and uninhabitableness. It is calculated in general that working men's cottages last only 40 years on the average. This sounds strangely enough when one sees the fine-looking walls of newly built ones, which seem to give promise of lasting a couple of centuries. But the fact remains that the niggardliness of the original expenditure, the neglectful repairs, the frequent periods of emptiness, the constant change of inhabitants, and the destruction carried on by the dwellers during the final 10 years, usually Irish families, who do not hesitate to use the wooden portions for firewood, all this, taken together, accomplishes the complete ruin of the cottages at the end of 40 years. Hence it comes that Ancoats, built chiefly since the sudden growth of manufacture, chiefly indeed within the present century, contains a vast number of ruinous houses, most of them being, in fact, in the last stages of uninhabitableness. I will not district clean, decent, and inhabitable for years together. I have to deal here with the state of the houses and their inhabitants, and it must be admitted that no more injurious and demoralizing method of housing the workers has yet been discovered than precisely this. The working man is constrained to occupy such ruinous dwellings because he cannot pay for others, and because there are no others in the vicinity of his mill. Perhaps, too, because they belong to the employer, who engages him only on condition of his taking such a cottage. The calculation with reference to the 40 years' duration of the cottage is, of course, not always perfectly strict. For, if the dwellings are in a thickly built-up portion of the town, and there is a good prospect of finding steady occupants for them, while the ground rent is high, the contractors do a little something to keep the cottages inhabitable after the expiration of the 40 years. They never do anything more, however, than is absolutely unavoidable, and the dwellings so repaired are the worst of all. The otherwise sleepy conscience of the sanitary police is a little stirred. Raids are made into the working men's districts, whole rows of cellars and cottages are closed, as happened in the case of several lanes near Oldham Road, but this does not last long. The condemned cottages soon find occupants again, the owners are much better off by letting them, and the sanitary police will not come again soon. These east and northeast sides of Manchester are the only ones on which the bourgeoisie has not built, because 10 or 11 months of the year the west and southwest wind drives the smoke of all the factories hither, and that is for the working people alone to breathe. Southward from Great Ancoat Street lies a great straggling working men's quarter, a hilly, barren stretch of land, occupied by detached, irregularly built rows of houses or squares. Between these empty building lots, uneven, clayey, without grass and scarcely passable in wet weather. The cottages are all filthy and old and recall the new town to mind. The stretch cut through by the Birmingham Railway is the most thickly built up and the worst. Here flows the Medlock with countless windings through a valley, which is, in places, on a level with the valley of the Irk. Along both sides of the stream, which is coal-black, stagnant and foul, stretches a broad belt of factories and the working men's dwellings, the latter all in the worst condition. The bank is chiefly steep and is built over to the water's edge, just as we saw along the Irk, while the houses are equally bad, whether built on the Manchester side or in Ardwick, Chorlton or Hume. But the most horrible spot, if I should describe all the separate spots in detail, I should never come to the end, lies on the Manchester side, immediately southwest of Oxford Road, and is known as Little Ireland. In a rather deep hole, in a curve of the Medlock, and surrounded on all four sides by tall factories and high embankments, covered with buildings, stand two groups of about 200 cottages, built chiefly back-to-back, in which live about 4,000 human beings, most of them Irish. The cottages are old, dirty, and of the smallest sort, the streets uneven, fallen into ruts, and in part without drains or pavement. Masses of refuse, offal, and sickening filth lie among standing pools in all directions. The atmosphere is poisoned by the effluvia from these, and laden and darkened by the smoke of a dozen tall factory chimneys. A horde of ragged women and children swarm about here, as filthy as the swine that drive upon the garbage heaps and in the puddles. In short, the whole rookery furnishes such a hateful and repulsive spectacle as can hardly be equalled in the worst court on the Irk. The race that lives in these ruinous cottages, behind broken windows, mended with oilskin, sprung doors, and rotten doorposts, or in dark, wet cellars, is measureless filth and stench. In this atmosphere, penned in as if with a purpose, this race must really have reached the lowest stage of humanity. This is the impression and the line of thought which the exterior of this district forces upon the beholder. But what must one think when he hears that in each of these pens, containing at most 2 rooms, a garret, and perhaps a cellar, on the average 20 human beings live? That in the whole region, for each 120 persons, one usually inaccessible privy is provided? And that in spite of all the preachings of the physicians, in spite of the excitement into which the cholera epidemic plunged the sanitary police by reason of the condition of Little Ireland, in spite of everything, in this year of grace 1844, it is in almost the same state as in 1831. Dr. Kay asserts that not only the cellars but the first floors of all the houses in this district are damp, that a number of cellars once filled up with earth have now been emptied and are occupied once more by Irish people, that in one cellar the water constantly wells up through a hole stopped with clay, the cellar lying below the river level, so that its occupant, a handloom weaver, had to bail out the water from his dwelling every morning and pour it into the street. Farther down, on the left side of the Medlock, lies Hume, which, properly speaking, is one great working people's district, the condition of which coincides almost exactly with that of Ancoats, the more thickly built-up regions chiefly bad and approaching ruin, the less populous of more modern structure, but generally sunk in filth. On the other side of the Medlock, in Manchester proper, lies a second great working men's district which stretches on both sides of Deansgate as far as the business quarter, and in certain parts rivals the old town. In Peter Streets, the crowded construction exceeds in places the narrowest courts of the old town. Here are long, narrow lanes between which run contracted, crooked courts and passages, the entrances to which are so irregular that the explorer is caught in a blind alley at every few steps, or comes out where he least expects to, unless he knows every court and every alley exactly and separately. According to Dr. Kay, the most demoralized class of all in Manchester lived in these ruinous and filthy districts, people whose occupations were thieving and prostitution, and to all appearance his assertion is still true at the present moment. When the sanitary police made its expedition hither in 1831, it found the uncleanness as great as in Little Ireland or along the Irk. That it is not much better today, I can testify. And among other items they found in Parliament Street for 380 persons, and in Parliament Passage for 30 thickly populated houses but a single privy. If we cross the Irwell into Salford, we find on a peninsula formed by the river a town of 80,000 inhabitants, which, properly speaking, is one large working men's quarter, penetrated by a single wide avenue. Salford, once more important than Manchester, was then the leading town of the surrounding district to which it still gives its name, Salford Hundred. Hence it is that an old and therefore very unwholesome, dirty and ruinous locality is to be found here lying opposite the old church of Manchester, and in as bad a condition as the old town on the other side of the Irwell. Farther away from the river lies the newer portion, which is, however, already beyond the limit of its 40 years of cottage life, and therefore ruinous enough. Old Salford is built in courts or narrow lanes, so narrow that they remind me of the narrowest I have ever seen, the little lanes of Genoa. The average construction of Salford is in this respect much worse than that of Manchester, and so too in respect of cleanliness. If in Manchester the police force from time to time every 6 or 10 years makes a raid upon the working people's districts, closes the worst dwellings and causes the filthiest spots in these Augean stables to be cleansed, in Salford it seems to have done absolutely nothing. The narrow side lanes and courts of Chapel Street, Greengate and Gravel Lane have certainly never been cleansed since they were built. Of late, the Liverpool Railway has been carried through the middle of them, over a high viaduct, and has abolished many of the filthiest nooks. But what does that avail? Whoever passes over this viaduct and looks down sees filth and wretchedness enough. And if anyone takes the trouble to pass through these lanes, and glance through the open doors and windows into the houses and cellars, he can convince himself afresh with every step that the workers of Salford live in dwellings in which cleanliness and comfort are impossible. Exactly the same state of affairs is found in the more distant regions of Salford, in Islington, along Regent Road and behind the Bolton Railway. The working men's dwellings between Oldfield Road and Cross Lane, where a mass of courts and alleys are to be found in the worst possible state, vie with the dwellings of the old town in filth and overcrowding. In this district, I found a man, apparently about 60 years old, living in a cow stable. He had constructed a sort of chimney for his square pen, which had neither windows, floor, nor ceiling. Had obtained a bedstead and lived there, though the rain dripped through his rotten roof. This man was too old and weak for regular work, and supported himself by removing manure with a handcart. The dung heaps lay next door to his palace. Such are the various working people's quarters of Manchester as I had occasion to observe them personally during 20 months. If we briefly formulate the result of our wanderings, we must admit that 350,000 working people of Manchester and its environs live, almost all of them, in wretched, damp, filthy cottages, that the streets which surround them are usually in the most miserable and filthy condition, laid out without the slightest reference to ventilation, with reference solely to the profit secured by the contractor. In a word, we must confess that in the working men's dwellings of Manchester, no cleanliness, no convenience, and consequently no comfortable family life is possible. That in such dwellings only a physically degenerate race, robbed of all humanity, degraded, reduced morally and physically to bestiality, could feel comfortable and at home. And I am not alone in making this assertion. We have seen that Dr. K gives precisely the same description, and though it is superfluous, I quote further the words of a liberal, recognized and highly valued as an authority by the manufacturers and a fanatical opponent of all independent movements of the workers. As I passed down through the dwellings of the mill hands in Irishtown, Ancoats, and Little Ireland, I was only amazed that it is possible to maintain a reasonable state of health in such homes. These towns, for an extent and number of inhabitants, they are towns, have been erected with the utmost disregard of everything except the immediate advantage of the speculating builder. A carpenter and builder unite to buy a series of building sites, i.e., they lease them for a number of years, and cover them with so-called houses. In one place we found a whole street following the course of a ditch, because in this way deeper cellars could be secured without the cost of digging. Cellars not for storing wares or rubbish, but for dwellings for human beings. Not one house of this street escaped the cholera. In general, the streets of these suburbs are unpaved with a dung heap or ditch in the middle. The houses are built back to back without ventilation or drainage, and whole families are limited to a corner of a cellar or a garret. I have already referred to the unusual activity which the sanitary police manifested during the cholera visitation. When the epidemic was approaching, a universal terror seized the bourgeoisie of the city. People remembered the unwholesome dwellings of the poor, and trembled before the certainty that each of these slums would become a centre for the plague, whence it would spread desolation in all directions through the houses of the property class. A health commission was appointed at once to investigate these districts and report upon their condition to the town council. Dr. K, himself a member of this commission, who visited in person every separate police district except one, the 11th, quotes extracts from their reports. There were inspected in all 6,951 houses, naturally in Manchester proper alone, Salford and the other suburbs being excluded. Of these, 6,565 urgently needed whitewashing within, 960 were out of repair, 939 had insufficient drains, 1,435 were damp, 452 were badly ventilated, 2,221 were without privies. Of the 687 streets inspected, 248 were unpaved, 53 but partially paved, 112 ill-ventilated, 352 containing standing pools, heaps of debris, refuse, etc. To cleanse such an augeant stable before the arrival of the cholera was, of course, out of the question. A few of the worst nooks were therefore cleansed, and everything else left as before. In the cleansed spots, as Little Ireland proves, the old filthy condition was naturally restored in a couple of months. As to the internal condition of these houses, the same commission reports a state of things similar to that which we have already met with in London, Edinburgh, and other cities. It often happens that a whole Irish family is crowded into one bed. Often a heap of filthy straw or quilts of old sacking cover all in an indiscriminate heap, where all alike are degraded by want, apathy, and wretchedness. Often the inspectors found in a single house 2 families in 2 rooms. All slept in one and used the other as a kitchen and dining room in common. Often more than one family lived in a single damp cellar in whose pestilent atmosphere 12 to 16 persons were crowded together. To these and other sources of disease must be added that pigs were kept and other disgusting things of the most revolting kind were found. We must add that many families who had but one room for themselves received boarders and lodgers in it, that such lodgers of both sexes by no means rarely sleep in the same bed with the married couple, and that the single case of a man and his wife and his adult sister-in-law sleeping in one bed was found, according to the report concerning the sanitary condition of the working class, 6 times repeated in Manchester. Common lodging houses, too, are very numerous. Dr. Kay gives their number in 1831 as 267 in Manchester proper, and they must have increased greatly since then. Each of these receives from 20 to 30 guests, so that they shelter all told nightly from 5 to 7,000 human beings. The character of the houses and their guests is the same as in other cities. 5 to 7 beds in each room lie on the floor, without bedsteads, and on these sleep, mixed indiscriminately, as many persons as apply. What physical and moral atmosphere reigns in these halls I need not state. Each of these houses is a focus of crime, the scene of deeds against which human nature revolts, which would perhaps never have been perpetrated but for this forced centralization of vice. Gaskell gives the number of persons living in cellars in Manchester proper as 20,000. The Weekly Dispatch gives the number, according to official reports, as 12% of the working class, which agrees with Gaskell's number, the workers being estimated at 175,000, 21,000 would form 12% of it. The cellar dwellings in the suburbs are at least as numerous, so that the number of persons living in cellars in Manchester, using its name in the broader sense, is not less than 40 to 50,000. So much for the dwellings of the workers in the larger cities and towns. The manner in which the need of a shelter is satisfied furnishes a standard for the manner in which all other necessities are supplied. That in these filthy holes a ragged, ill-fed population alone can dwell is a safe conclusion, and such is the fact. The clothing of the working people, and in the majority of cases, is in a very bad condition. The material used for it is not of the best adapted. Wool and linen have almost vanished from the wardrobe of both sexes, and cotton has taken their place. Shirts are made of bleached or coloured cotton goods. The dresses of the women are chiefly of cotton print goods, and woolen petticoats are rarely to be seen on the washline. The men wear chiefly trousers of fustian or other heavy cotton goods, and jackets or coats of the same. Fustian has become the proverbial costume of the working men, who are called fustian jackets, and call themselves so in contrast to the gentlemen who wear broadcloth, which latter words are used as characteristic for the middle class. When Fergus O'Connor, the Chartist leader, came to Manchester during the insurrection of 1842, he appeared, amidst the deafening applause of the working men, in a fustian suit of clothing. Hats are the universal head covering in England, even for working men, hats of the most diverse forms, round, high, broad-brimmed, narrow-brimmed, or without brims. Only the younger men in factory towns wearing caps. Anyone who does not own a hat finds himself a low, square paper cap. The whole clothing of the working class, even assuming it to be in good condition, is little adapted to the climate. The damp air of England, with its sudden changes of temperature, more calculated than any other to give rise to colds, obliges almost the whole middle class to wear flannel next to the skin, about the body, and flannel scarves and shirts are in almost universal use. Not only is the working class deprived of this precaution, it is scarcely ever in a position to use a thread of woolen clothing, and the heavy cotton goods, though thicker, stiffer, and heavier than woolen clothes, afford much less protection against cold and wet, remain damp much longer because of their thickness and the nature of the stuff, and have nothing of the compact density of fulled woolen cloths. And if a working man once buys himself a woolen coat For Sunday, he must get it from one of the cheap shops where he finds bad so-called devil's dust cloth, manufactured for sale and not for use, and liable to tear or grow threadbare in a fortnight. Or he must buy of an old clothes dealer a half-worn coat which has seen its best days and lasts but a few weeks. Moreover, the working man's clothing is, in most cases, in bad condition, and there is the oft-recurring necessity for placing the best pieces in the pawnbroker's shop. But among very large numbers, especially among the Irish, the prevailing clothing consists of perfect rags beyond all mending, or so patched that the original colour can no longer be detected. Yet the English and Anglo-Irish go on patching, and have carried this art to a remarkable pitch, putting wool or bagging or fustian, or the reverse. It is all the same to them. But the true transplanted Irish hardly ever patch except in the extremest necessity, when the garment would otherwise fall apart. Ordinarily, the rags of the shirt protrude through the rents in the coat or trousers. They wear, as Thomas Carlyle says, a suit of tatters, the getting on or off of which is said to be a difficult operation, transacted only in festivals and the high tides of the calendar. The Irish have introduced, too, the custom previously unknown in England of going barefoot. In every manufacturing town there is now to be seen a multitude of people, especially women and children, going about barefoot, and their example is gradually being adopted by the poorer English. As with clothing, so with food. The workers get what is too bad for the property-holding class. In the great towns of England, everything may be had to the best, but it costs money, and the workman, who must keep house on a couple of pence, cannot afford much expense. Moreover, he usually receives his wages on Saturday evening, for, although a beginning has been made of the payment of wages on Friday, this excellent arrangement is by no means universal, and so he comes to market at 5 or even 7 o'clock, while the buyers of the middle class have had the first choice during the morning, when the market teems with the best of everything. But when the workers reach it, the best has vanished, and if it was still there, they would probably not be able to buy it. The potatoes which the workers buy are usually poor, the vegetables wilted, the cheese old and of poor quality, the bacon rancid, the meat lean, tough, taken from old, often diseased cattle, or such as have died a natural death, and not fresh even then, often half decayed. The sellers are usually small hucksters who buy up inferior goods and can sell them cheaply by reason of their badness. The poorest workers are forced to use still another device to get together the things they need with their few pence. As nothing can be sold on Sunday and all shops must be closed at 12 o'clock on Saturday night, such things as would not keep until Monday are sold at any price between 10 o'clock and midnight. But 9/10 of what is sold at 10 o'clock is past using by Sunday morning. Yet these are precisely the provisions which make up the Sunday dinner of the poorest class. The meat which the workers buy is very often past using, but having bought it, they must eat it. On the 6th of January 1844, if I am not greatly mistaken, a court leet was held in Manchester, when 11 meat sellers were fined for having sold tainted meat. Each of them had a whole ox or pig, or several sheep, or from 50 to 60 pounds of meat, which were all confiscated in a tainted condition. In one case, 64 stuffed Christmas geese were seized, which had proved unsaleable in Liverpool and had been forwarded to Manchester, where they were brought to market foul and rotten. All the particulars, with names and fines, were published at the time in the Manchester Guardian. In the 6 weeks from the 1st of July to the 14th of August, the same sheet reported 3 similar cases. According to the Guardian, for the 3rd of August, a pig weighing 200 pounds, which had been found dead and decayed, was cut up and exposed for sale by a butcher at Haywood, and was then seized. According to the number for the 31st of July, 2 butchers at Wigan, of whom one had previously been convicted of the same offence, were fined £2 and £4 respectively, for exposing tainted meat for sale, and according to the number for the 10th of August, 26 tainted hams seized at a dealer's in Bolton were publicly burnt, and the dealer fined 20 shillings. But these are by no means all the cases. They do not even form a fair average for a period of 6 weeks, according to which to form an average for the year. There are often seasons in which every number of the semi-weekly Guardian mentions a similar case found in Manchester or its vicinity. And when one reflects upon the many cases which must escape detention in the extensive markets that stretch along the front of every main street, under the slender supervision of the market inspectors, and how else can one explain the boldness with which whole animals are exposed for sale? When one considers how great the temptation must be, in view of the incomprehensibly small fines mentioned in the foregoing cases, when one reflects what condition a piece of meat must have reached to be seized by the inspectors, it is impossible to believe that the workers obtain good and nourishing meat as a usual thing. But they are victimized in yet another way by the money greed of the middle class. Dealers and manufacturers adulterate all kinds of provisions in an atrocious manner, and without the slightest regard to the health of the consumers. We have heard the Manchester Guardian upon this subject. Let us hear another organ of the middle class. I delight in the testimony of my opponents. Let us hear the Liverpool Mercury. Salted butter is sold for fresh, the lumps being covered with a coating of fresh butter or a pound of fresh being laid on top to taste, while the salted article is sold after this test, or the whole mass is washed and then sold as fresh. With sugar, pounded rice and other cheap adulterating materials are mixed, and the whole sold at full price. The refuse of soap boiling establishments also is mixed with other things and sold as sugar. Chicory and other cheap stuff is mixed with ground coffee, and artificial coffee beans with the unground article. Cocoa is often adulterated with fine brown earth, treated with fat to render it more easily mistakable for real cocoa. Tea is mixed with the leaves of the sloe, and with other refuse or dry tea leaves are roasted on hot copper plates, so returning to the proper color and being sold as fresh. Pepper is mixed with pounded nutshells. Port wine is manufactured outright, out of alcohol, dye snuffs, etc., while it is notorious that more of it is consumed in England alone than is grown in Portugal. And tobacco is mixed with disgusting substances of all sorts and in all possible forms in which the article is produced. I can add that several of the most respected tobacco dealers in Manchester announced publicly last summer that by reason of the universal adulteration of tobacco, no firm could carry on business without adulteration, and that no cigar costing less than 3p is made wholly from tobacco. These frauds are naturally not restricted to articles of food, although I could mention a dozen more, and villainy of mixing gypsum or chalk with flour among them. Fraud is practiced in the sale of articles of every sort. Flannel, stockings, etc. are stretched and shrink after the first washing. Narrow cloth is sold as being from 1.5 to 3 inches broader than it actually is. Stoneware is so thinly glazed that the glazing is good for nothing and cracks at once, and 100 other rascalities. Tout comme chez nous. But the lion's share of the evil results of these frauds fall to the workers. The rich are less deceived because they can pay the high prices of the large shops, which have a reputation to lose, and would injure themselves more than their customers if they kept poor or unadulterated wares. The rich are spoiled too by habitual good eating, and detect adulteration more easily than with their sensitive palates. But the poor, the working people, to whom a couple of farthings are important, who must buy many things with little money, who cannot afford to inquire too closely into the quality of their purchases, and cannot do so in any case because they have had no opportunity of cultivating their taste, to their share fall all the adulterated, poisoned provisions. They must deal with the small retailers, must buy perhaps on credit, and these small retail dealers who cannot sell even the same quality of goods so cheaply as the largest retailers, because of their small capital and the large proportional expenses of their business, must knowingly or unknowingly buy adulterated goods in order to sell at the lower prices required. And to meet the competition of the others, further, a large retail dealer who has extensive capital invested in his business is ruinous with his ruined credit if detected in a fraudulent practice. But what harm does it do a small grocer who has customers in a single street only if frauds are proved against him? If no one trusts him in Ancoats, he moves to Chorlton or Hume, where no one knows him, and where he continues to defraud as before, while legal penalties attach to very few adulterations unless they involve revenue frauds. Not in the quality alone, but in the quantity of his goods as well, is the English working man defrauded. The small dealers usually have false weights and measures, and an incredible number of convictions for such offences may be read for the police reports. How universal this form of fraud is in the manufacturing districts, a couple of extracts from the Manchester Guardian may serve to show. They cover only a short period, and even here I have not all the numbers at hand. Guardian, 16th June 1844, Rochdale Sessions. 4 dealers fined 5 to 10 shillings for using light weights. Stockport sessions. 2 dealers fined 1 shilling, one of them having 7 light weights at a false scale, and both having been warned. Guardian, 19th June, Rochdale sessions. 1 dealer fined 5 and 2 farmers 10 shillings. Guardian, 22nd June, Manchester Justices of the Peace. 19 dealers fined 2 shillings and sixpence to £2. Guardian, 26th June, Ashton sessions. 14 dealers and farmers fined 2 shillings and sixpence to £1. Hyde Petty Sessions, 9 farmers and dealers condemned to pay costs and 5 shilling fines. Guardian, 9th July, Manchester, 16 dealers condemned to pay costs and fines not exceeding 10 shillings. Guardian, 13th July, Rochdale, 9 dealers fined from 2 shillings and sixpence to 20 shillings. Guardian, 24th July, Rochdale, 4 dealers fined 10 to 20 shillings. Guardian, 27th July, Bolton, 12 dealers and innkeepers condemned to pay costs. Guardian, 3rd of August, Bolton, 3 dealers fined 2 shillings and sixpence and 5 shillings. Guardian, 10th of August, Bolton, 1 dealer fined 5 shillings. And the same causes which make the working class the chief sufferers from frauds in the quality of goods make them the usual victims of frauds in the question of quantity too. The habitual food of the individual working man naturally varies according to his wages. The better paid workers, especially those in whose families every member is able to earn something, have good food as long as this state of things lasts: meat daily and bacon and cheese for supper. Where wages are less, meat is used only 2 or 3 times a week, and the proportion of bread and potatoes increases. Descending gradually, we find the animal food reduced to a small piece of bacon cut up with the potatoes. Lower still, even this disappears, and there remain only bread, cheese, porridge, and potatoes, until on the lowest round of the ladder, among the Irish, potatoes form the sole food. As an accompaniment, weak tea with perhaps a little sugar, milk, or spirits is universally drunk. Tea is regarded in England, and even in Ireland, as quite as indispensable as coffee in Germany, and where no tea is used, the bitterest poverty reigns. But all this presupposes that the workman has work. When he has none, he is wholly at the mercy of accident, and eats what is given him, what he can beg or steal. And if he gets nothing, he simply starves, as we have seen. The quantity of food varies, of course, like its quality, according to the rate of wages, so that among ill-paid workers, even if they have no large families, hunger prevails in spite of full and regular work. And the number of the ill-paid is very large, especially in London, where the competition of the workers rises with the increase of population. This class is very numerous, but it is to be found in other towns as well. In these cases, all sorts of devices are used. Potato parings, vegetable refuse, and rotten vegetables are eaten for want of other food, and everything greedily gathered up which may possibly contain an atom of nourishment. And as the week's wages are used up before the end of the week, it often enough appears that in the closing days the family gets only as much food, if any, as is barely sufficient to keep off starvation. Of course, such a way of living unavoidably engenders a multitude of diseases, and when these appear, when the father by whose work the family is chiefly supported, whose physical exertion most demands nourishment, and who therefore first succumbs, when the father is utterly disabled, then misery reaches its height, and then the brutality with which society abandons its members, just when their need is greatest, comes out fully into the light of day. To sum up briefly the facts thus far cited. The great towns are chiefly inhabited by working people, since in the best case there is one of better class for 2 workers, often for 3, here and there for 4. These workers have no property whatsoever of their own, and live wholly upon wages which usually go from hand to mouth. Society, composed wholly of atoms, does not trouble itself about them, leaves them to care for themselves and their families, yet supplies them no means of doing this in an efficient and permanent manner. Every working man, even the best, is therefore constantly exposed to loss of work and food, that is, to death by starvation, and many perish in this way. The dwellings of the workers are everywhere badly planned, badly built, and kept in the worst condition, badly ventilated, damp, and unwholesome. The inhabitants are confined to the smallest possible space, and at least one family usually sleeps in each room. The interior arrangement of the dwellings is poverty-stricken in various degrees, down to the utter absence of even the most necessary furniture. The clothing of the workers, too, is generally scanty, and that of great multitudes is in rags. The food is, in general, bad, often almost unfit for use, and in many cases, at least at times, insufficient in quantity, so that in cases, death by starvation results. Thus, the working class of the great cities offers a graduated scale of conditions in life, in the best cases a temporarily endurable existence, for hard work and good wages, good and endurable. That is, from the worker's standpoint, even in the worst cases, bitter want, reaching even homelessness and death by starvation. The average is much nearer the worst case than the best. And this series does not fall into fixed classes, so that one might say this fraction of the working class is well off, has always been so, and remains so. If that is the case here and there, if single branches of work have in general an advantage over others, yet the condition of the workers in each branch is subject to such great fluctuations that a single working man may be so placed as to pass through the whole range from comparative comfort to the extremest need, even to death by starvation, while almost every working man can tell a tale of marked changes of fortune. Let us examine the causes of this somewhat more closely. Okay, that's the end of that chapter, and I'm going to take just a quick break to inspect the chat and see how we're doing. Thank you, Sade. Thanks, Damien. Solidarity to people for profit. Hi there, Chris. Acorn's at the march today, trying to further the case for landlord licensing here in Sheffield. I'm there in spirit with you, Chris. If I can't join the rest of my Acorn comrades today, helping out with that. Diane, it was a while ago I was talking about Style Mill, so I'd have to go back and check that. But yeah. Thank you, everyone. Just to say again for donating as you have so far. I'll check. Well, I've got time now. I'll check one more time. I'll check how we're doing. 26 messages. Oof. Okay, just inspecting. Oh, cheers, Eve. I believe you're now in Sheffield. No. Again. Whereabouts? Thanks for tuning in, by the way. Woo, £230, surpassed the target. Superb. Okay, well, thanks everyone for donating so far, and yeah, and thank you, E, for your donation in particular. Thanks, Rob. Thanks, Hubby. Oh, cool. Oh, well, thanks for all your donations so far. Nether Edge. Ah, lovely. Cool. Right, I'm just going to take a slug of squash, and then we'll move on to the next chapter. Okay. 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 So in the next chapter, competition. We have seen in the introduction how competition created the proletariat at the very beginning of the industrial movement by increasing the wages of weavers in consequence of the increased demand for woven goods, so inducing devoting themselves to their looms. We have seen how it crowded out the small farmers by means of the large farm system, reduced them to the rank of proletarians, and attracted them in part into the towns. how it further ruined the small bourgeoisie in great measure and reduced its members also to the ranks of the proletariat, how it centralized capital in the hands of the few and population in the great towns. Such are the various ways and means by which competition, as it reached its full manifestation and free development in modern industry, created and extended the proletariat. We shall now have to observe its influence on the working class already created. And here we must begin by tracing the results of competition of single workers with one another. Competition is the completest expression of the battle of all against all which rules in modern civil society, only, but also between the individual members of these classes. Each is in the way of the other, and each seeks to crowd out all who are in his way, and to put himself in their place. The workers are in as constant competition among themselves as the members of the bourgeoisie among themselves. The powerloom weaver is in competition with the handloom weaver, the unemployed or ill-paid handloom weaver with the man who has work or is better paid, each trying to supplant the other. But this competition of the workers among themselves is the worst side of the present state of things in its effect upon the worker, the sharpest weapon against the proletariat in the hands of the bourgeoisie. Hence the effort of the workers to nullify this competition by associations, hence the hatred of the bourgeoisie towards these associations, and its triumph in every defeat which befalls them. The proletarian is helpless. Left to himself, he cannot live a single day. The bourgeoisie has gained a monopoly by the power of the state. The proletarian is, therefore, in law and in fact, the slave of the bourgeoisie, which can decree his life or death. It offers him the means of living, but only for an equivalent for his work. It even lets him have the appearance of acting from a free choice of making a contract with free, unconstrained consent as a responsible agent who has attained his majority. Fine freedom, where the proletarian has no other choice than that of either accepting the conditions which the bourgeoisie offers him, or of starving, of freezing to death, of sleeping naked among the beasts of the forests. A fine equivalent valued at pleasure by the bourgeoisie. And if one proletarian is such a fool as to starve rather than agree to the equitable propositions of the bourgeoisie, his natural superiors, another is easily found in his place. There are proletarians enough in the world, and not all so insane as to prefer dying to living. Here we have the competition of the workers among themselves. If all the proletarians announced their determination to starve rather than work for the bourgeoisie, the latter would have to surrender his monopoly. But this is not the case, is indeed a rather impossible case, so the bourgeoisie still thrives. To this competition of the worker there is but one limit. No worker will work for less than he needs to subsist. If he must starve, he will prefer to starve in idleness rather than in toil. True, this limit is relative. One needs more than another. One is accustomed to more comfort than another. The Englishman, who is still somewhat civilized, needs more than the Irishman who goes in rags, eats potatoes, and sleeps in a pigsty. But that does not hinder the Irishman's competing with the Englishman, and gradually forcing the rate of wages, and with it the Englishman's level of civilization, down to the Irishman's level. Certain kinds of work require a certain grade of civilization, and to these belong almost all forms of industrial occupation. Hence the interest of the bourgeoisie requires in this case that wages should be high enough to enable the workman to keep himself upon the required plane. The new Irish immigrant street after a week because he spends everything upon drink and cannot pay rent would be a poor mill hand. The mill hand must, therefore, have wages enough to enable him to bring up his children to regular work, but no more, lest he should be able to get on without the wages of his children, and so make something else of them than mere working men. Here, too, the limit, the minimum wage, is relative. When every member of the family works, the individual worker can get on with proportionately less, and the bourgeoisie has made the most of the opportunity of employing and making profit and children afforded by machine work. Of course, it is not in every family that every member can be set to work, and those in which the case is otherwise would be in a bad way if obliged to exist upon the minimum wage possible to a wholly employed family. Hence, the usual wages form an average according to which a fully employed family gets on from luxury to which he was accustomed to not living at all, prefers a pig pen to no roof, wears rags in preference to going naked, confines himself to a potato diet in preference to starvation. He contents himself with half pay and the hope of better times rather than be driven into the street to perish before the eyes of the world, as so many have done who had no work whatsoever. This trifle, therefore, this something more than nothing, is the minimum of wages. And if there are more workers at hand than the bourgeoisie thinks well to employ, if at the end of the battle of competition there yet remain workers who find nothing to do, they must simply starve. For the bourgeois will hardly give them work if he cannot sell the produce of their labor at a profit. From this, it is evident what the minimum of wages is. The maximum is determined by the competition of the bourgeoisie among themselves, for we have seen how they too must compete with each other. The bourgeois can increase his capital only in commerce and manufacture, and in both cases he needs workers. Even if he invests his capital in interest, he needs them indirectly. For without commerce and manufacture, no one would pay him interest upon his capital, so no one could use it. So the bourgeois certainly needs workers, not indeed for his immediate living, for need he could consume his capital, but as we need an article of trade or a beast of burden, as a means of profit. The proletarian produces the goods which the bourgeois sells with advantage. When, therefore, the demand for these goods increases so that all the competing working men are employed, and a few more might perhaps be useful, the competition among the workers falls away, and the bourgeoisie begin to compete among themselves. The capitalist in search of workmen knows very well that his profits increase as prices rise in consequence of the increased demand for his goods, and pays a trifle higher wages rather than let the whole profit escape him. He sends the butter to fetch the cheese, and getting the latter, leaves the butter ungrudgingly to the workers. So one capitalist after another goes in chase of workers and wages rise, but only as high as the increasing demand permits. If the capitalist, who willingly sacrifices a part of his extraordinary profit, runs into danger of sacrificing any part of his ordinary average profit, he takes very good care not to pay more than average wages. From this, we can determine the average rate of wages. Under average circumstances, when neither workers nor capitalists have reason to compete, especially among themselves, when there are just as many workers at hand as can be employed in producing precisely the goods that are demanded, wages stand a little above the minimum. How far they rise above the minimum will depend upon the average needs and the grade of civilization of the workers. If the workers are accustomed to eat meat several times in the week, the capitalists must reconcile themselves to paying wages enough to make this food attainable, not less, because the workers are not competing among themselves and have no occasion to content themselves with less, not more, because the capitalists, in the absence of competition among themselves, have no occasion to attract working men by extraordinary favors. This standard of the average needs and the average civilization of the workers has become very complicated by reason of the complications of English industry, and is different for different sorts of workers, as has been pointed out. Most industrial occupations demand a certain skill and regularity, and for these qualities which involve a certain grade of civilization, the rate of wages must be such as to induce the worker to acquire such skill and subject himself to such regularity. Hence it is that the average wages of industrial workers are higher than those of mere porters, day laborers, etc., higher especially than those of agricultural laborers, a fact to which the additional cost of the necessities of life in cities contributes somewhat. In other words, the worker is, in law and in fact, the slave of the property-holding class, so effectively a slave that he is sold like a piece of goods, rises and falls in value like a commodity. If the demand for workers increases, the price of workers rises. If it falls so greatly that a number of them become unsaleable, if they are left in stock, they are simply left idle, and as they cannot live upon that, they die of starvation. For, to speak in the words of the economists, the expense incurred in maintaining them would not be reproduced, would be money thrown away. And to this end, no man advances capital. And so far, Malthus was perfectly right in his theory of population. The only difference as compared with the old outspoken slavery is this, that the worker of today seems to be free because he is not sold once for all, but piecemeal by the day, the week, the year, and because no one owner sells him to another, but he is forced to sell himself in this way instead, being the slave of no particular person, but of the whole property-holding class. For him, the matter is unchanged at bottom, and if this semblance of liberty necessarily gives him some real freedom on the one hand, it entails on the other the disadvantage that no one guarantees him a subsistence. He is in danger of being repudiated at any moment by his master, the bourgeoisie, and left to die of starvation, if the bourgeoisie ceases to have an interest in his employment, his existence. The bourgeoisie, on the other hand, is far better off under the present arrangement than under the old slave system. It can dismiss its employees at discretion without sacrificing invested capital, and gets its work done much more cheaply than is possible with slave labor, as Adam Smith comfortingly pointed out. Hence it follows too that Adam Smith was perfectly right in making the assertion that the demand for men, like that for any other commodity, necessarily regulates the production of men, quickens it when it goes on too quickly, and stops it when it advances too fast. Just as in the case of any other commodity. If there are too few laborers at hand, prices, i.e. wages, rise. The workers are more prosperous, marriages multiply, more children are born, and more live to grow up, until a sufficient number of laborers has been secured. If there are too many on hand, prices fall, want of work, poverty and starvation and consequent diseases arise, and the surplus population is put out of the way. And Malthus, who carried the foregoing proposition of Smith farther, was also right in his way in asserting that there is always a surplus population, that there are always too many people in the world. He is wrong only when he asserts that there are more people on hand than can be maintained from the available means of subsistence. Surplus population is engendered rather by the competition of the workers among themselves, which forces each separate worker to labor as much each day as his strength can possibly admit. If a manufacturer can employ 10 hands 9 hours daily, he can employ 9 if each works 10 hours, and the 10th goes hungry. And if a manufacturer can force the 9 hands to work an extra hour daily for the same wages by threatening to discharge them at a time when the demand for hands is not very great, he discharges the 10th and saves so much wages. This is the process on a small scale, which goes on in a nation on a large one. The productiveness of each hand, raised to the highest pitch by the competition of the workers among themselves, the division of labor, the introduction of machinery, the subjugation of the forces of nature, deprive a multitude of workers of bread. These starving workers are then removed from the market, they can buy nothing, and the quantity of articles of consumption previously required by them is no longer in demand, need no longer be produced. The workers previously employed in producing them are therefore driven out of work, and they're also removed from the market. And so it goes on, always the same old round, or rather, so it would go if other circumstances did not intervene. The introduction of the industrial forces already referred to for increasing production leads, in the course of time, to a reduction of prices of the articles produced and to consequent increased consumption, so that a large part of the displaced workers finally, after long suffering, find work again. If, in addition to this, the conquest of foreign markets constantly and rapidly increases the demand for manufactured goods, as has been the case in England during the past 60 years, the demand for hands increases, and in proportion to it, Thus, instead of diminishing, the population of Britain has increased with extraordinary rapidity and is still increasing. Yet, in spite of the extension of industry, in spite of the demand for working men which, in general, has increased, there is, according to the profession of all the official political parties, Tory, Whig, and Radical, permanent surplus, superfluous population. The competition among the workers is constantly greater than the competition to secure workers. Whence comes this incongruity? It lies in the nature of industrial competition and the commercial crises which are in the present unregulated production and distribution of the means of subsistence, which is carried on not directly for the sake of supplying needs, but for profit, in the system under which everyone works for himself to enrich himself, dislocations inevitably arise at every moment. For example, England supplies a number of countries with most diverse goods. Now, although the manufacturer may know how much of each article is consumed in each country annually, he cannot know how much is on hand at every given moment, much less can he know how much his competitors export thither. He can only draw most uncertain inferences from the perpetual fluctuations in prices as to the quantities on hand and the needs of the moment. He must trust to luck in exporting his goods. Everything is done blindly, and before long such a market is glutted, sales stop, capital remains inactive, prices fall, and English manufacture has no further employment for its hands. In the beginnings of the development of manufacture, these checks were limited to single branches and single markets, but the centralizing tendency of competition which drives the hands thrown out of one branch into such other branches as are most easily accessible and transfers the goods which cannot be disposed of in one market to other markets has gradually brought the single minor crises nearer together and united them into one periodically recurring crisis. Such a crisis usually recurs once every 5 years after a brief period of activity and general prosperity. The home market, like all foreign ones, is glutted with English goods, which it can only slowly absorb. The industrial movement comes to a standstill in almost every branch. The small manufacturers and merchants who cannot survive a prolonged inactivity of their invested capital fail. The larger ones suspend business during the worst season, close their mills or work short time, perhaps half the day. Wages fall by reason of the competition of the unemployed, the diminution of working time, and the lack of profitable sales. Want becomes universal among the workers. The small savings which individuals may have made are rapidly consumed. The philanthropic institutions are overburdened. The poor rates are doubled, trebled, and still insufficient. The number of the starving increases, and the whole multitude of surplus population presses in terrific numbers into the foreground. This continues for a time. The surplus exist as best they may, or perish. Philanthropy and the poor law help many of them to a painful prolongation of their existence. Others find scant means of subsistence here and there in such kinds of work as have been least open to competition or most remote from manufacture. And with how little can a human being keep body and soul together for a time? Gradually, the state of things improves. The accumulations of goods are consumed. The general depression among the men of commerce and manufacture prevents a too hasty replenishing of the markets, and at last rising prices and favorable reports from all directions restore activity. Most of the markets are distant ones. Demand increases and prices rise constantly while the first exports are arriving. Begin to buy upon speculation and so to withdraw from consumption the articles intended for it, just when they are most needed. Speculation forces prices still higher by encouraging others to purchase and appropriating new imports at once. All this is reported to England. Manufacturers begin to produce with a will. New mills are built. Every means is employed to make the most of the favorable moment. Speculation arises here too, exerting the same influences upon foreign markets, raising prices, withdrawing goods from consumption, spurring manufacture in both ways to the highest pitch of effort. Then come the daring speculators working with fictitious capital, living upon credit, ruined if they cannot speedily sell. They hurl themselves into this universal disorder madness. It is a frantic struggle which carries away even the most experienced and phlegmatic. Goods are spun, woven, hammered, as if all of money begin to sell, below market prices of course, for their need is urgent. One sale is followed by others, prices fluctuate, speculators throw their goods upon the market in error, the market is disordered, credit shaken, one house after another stops payments, bankruptcy follows bankruptcy, and the discovery is made that 3 times more goods are on hand or underway than can be consumed. The news reaches England, where production has been going on at full speed meanwhile. Panic seizes all hands. Failures abroad cause others in England. The panic crushes a number of firms. All reserves are thrown up on the market here too in the anxiety of the moment, and the alarm is still further exaggerated. This is the beginning of the crisis, which then takes precisely the same course as its predecessor and gives place in turn to a season of prosperity. So it goes on perpetually. Prosperity, crisis, and this perennial round in which English industry moves is, as has been before observed, usually completed once in 5 or 6 years. From this, it is clear that English manufacture must have, at all times save the brief periods of highest prosperity, an unemployed reserve army of workers in order to be able to produce the masses of goods required by the market in the liveliest months. This reserve army is larger or smaller according as the state of the market occasions the employment of a larger or smaller proportion of its members. And if at the moment of highest activity of the market, the agricultural districts, Ireland, and the branches least affected by the general prosperity temporarily supply to manufacture a number of workers, these are a mere minority. And these too belong to the reserve army with the single difference that the prosperity of the moment was required to reveal their connection with it. When they enter upon the more active branches of work, their former employers draw in somewhat, in order to feel the loss less, work longer hours, employ women and younger workers, and when the wanderers discharged at the beginning of the crisis return, they find their places filled and themselves superfluous, at least in the majority of cases. This reserve army, which embraces an immense multitude during the crisis and a large number during the period, which may be best regarded as the average between the highest prosperity and the crisis, is the surplus population of England, which keeps body and soul together by begging, stealing, street sweeping, collecting manure, pushing handcarts, driving donkeys, peddling, or performing occasional small jobs. In every great town, a multitude of such people may be found. It is astonishing in what devices this surplus population takes refuge. The London crossing sweepers are known all over the world, but hitherto the principal streets in all the great cities, as well as the crossings, have been swept by people out of other work, and employed by the poor law guardians or the municipal authorities for the purpose. Now, however, a machine has been invented which rattles through the streets daily and has spoiled this source of income for the unemployed. Along the great highways leading into the cities, on which there is a great deal of wagon traffic, a large number of people may be seen with small carts gathering fresh horse dung at the risk of their lives among the passing coaches and omnibuses, often paying a couple of shillings a week to the authorities for the privilege. But this occupation is forbidden in many places, because the ordinary street sweepings, thus impoverished, cannot be sold as manure. Happy are such of the surplus as can obtain a pushcart and go about it with it. Happier still those to whom it is vouchsafed to possess an ass in addition to the cart. The ass must get his own food, or is given a little gathered refuse, and can yet bring a trifle of money. Most of the surplus betake themselves to huckstering. On Saturday afternoons, especially when the whole working population is on the streets, the crowd who live from huckstering and peddling may be seen. Shoe and corset laces, braces, twine, cakes, oranges, every kind of small articles are offered by men, women, and children. And at other times also, such peddlers are always to be seen standing at the street corners or going about with cakes and ginger beer or latent mixtures for lighting fires are further resources of such vendors. Others, so-called jobbers, go about the streets seeking small jobs. Many of these succeed in getting a day's work, many are not so fortunate. At the gates of all the London docks, says the Reverend W. Champneys, preacher of the East End, hundreds of the poor appear every morning in winter before daybreak in the hope of getting a day's work. They await the opening of the gates, and when the youngest and strongest and best known have been engaged, hundreds cast down by disappointment, hope, go back to their wretched homes. When these people find no work and will not rebel against society, what remains for them but to beg? And surely no one can wonder at the great army of beggars, most of them able-bodied men, with whom the police carry on perpetual war. But the beggary of these men has peculiar character. Such a man usually goes about with his family singing a pleading song in the streets for appealing, in a speech, to the benevolence of the passers-by. And it is a striking fact that these beggars are seen almost exclusively in the working people's districts, that it is almost exclusively the gifts of the poor from which they live. Or the family takes up its position in a busy street and without uttering a word, lets the mere sight of its helplessness plead for it. In this case, too, they reckon upon the sympathy of the workers alone, who know from experience how it feels to be hungry, and are liable to find themselves in the same situation at any moment. For this dumb, yet almost moving appeal is met with almost solely in such streets as are frequented by working men, and at such hours as working men pass by, but especially on Saturday evenings, when the secrets of the working people's quarters are generally revealed, and the middle class withdraws as far as possible from the district thus polluted. And he among the surplus who has courage and passion enough openly to resist society, to reply with declared war upon the bourgeoisie to the disgusted war which the bourgeoisie wages upon him, goes forth to rob, plunder, murder, and burn. Of this surplus population, there are, according to the reports of the Poor Law Commissioners, on an average 1.5 million in England and Wales. In Scotland, the number cannot be ascertained for want of poor law regulations, and with Ireland we shall deal separately. Moreover, this 1.5 million includes only those who actually apply to the parish for relief. The great multitude who struggle on without recourse to this most hated expedient it does not embrace. On the other hand, a good part of the number belong to the agricultural districts and do not enter into the present discussion. During a crisis, this number naturally increases markedly, and want reaches its highest pitch. Take, for instance, the crisis of 1842, which, being the latest, was the most violent, for the intensity of the crisis increases with each repetition, and the next, which may be expected not later than 1847, will probably be still more violent and lasting. During this crisis, the poor rates rose in every town to a hitherto unknown height. In Stockport, among other towns, for every £1 paid in house rent, 8 shillings of poor rate had to be paid, so that the rate alone formed 40% of the house rent. Moreover, whole streets stood vacant, so that there were at least 20,000 fewer inhabitants than usual, and on the doors of the empty houses might be read, "Stockport to let." In Bolton, where, in ordinary years, the rents from which rates are paid average £86,000, they sank to £36,000. The number of the poor to be supported rose, on the other hand, to 14,000, or more than 20% of the whole number of inhabitants. In Leeds, the Poor Law Guardians had a reserve fund of £10,000. This, with a contribution of £7,000, was wholly exhausted before the crisis reached its height. So it was everywhere. A report drawn up in January 1843 by a committee of the Anti-Corn Law League on the condition of the industrial districts in 1842, which was based upon detailed statements of the manufacturers, asserts that the poor rate was, taking the average, twice as high as in 1839, and that the number of persons requiring relief was trebled, even quintupled, since that time, that a multitude of applicants belonged to a class which had never before solicited relief, that the working class commands more than 2/3 less of the means of subsistence than from 1834 to 1836, that the consumption of meat had been decidedly less, in some places 20%, in others reaching 60% less, that even handicraftsmen, smiths, bricklayers, and others who usually have full employment in the most depressed periods now suffered greatly from want of work and reduction of wages, and that even now, in January 1843, wages are still steadily falling. And these are the reports of manufacturers. The starving workmen, whose mills were idle, whose employers could give them no work, stood in the street